Arizona's ghost towns aren't just abandoned, they're waiting. Sliding jails that trap you inside while the ghosts recreate their executions. Mine furnaces that never stop burning, they just changed what they consume. Telegraph machines in empty stations that click out warnings about disasters from 1910 using your name. These 11 locations across Arizona have something in common. People went looking for history and found something that's been watching them back. Each town holds a different kind of nightmare, and tonight you'll experience all of them. If you survive these stories, hit that subscribe button and join the Verified Souls community. Drop a comment telling us which Arizona ghost town terrified you the most, and turn on notifications because we're bringing you the darkest stories from America's most haunted places. Let's begin with Jerome, where a building slides down a mountain with you still trapped inside. What would you do if you were locked inside a building that was physically moving down a mountainside with the ghosts of executed criminals? I never believed in ghosts until I spent 3 hours trapped inside Jerome's sliding jail with them. My podcast, Debunked Paranormal, had gained a decent following by exposing fake hauntings and manipulated evidence, and Jerome seemed like easy content. The town's most famous landmark, a jail that allegedly slid 225 feet down the mountain in 1938, had become a magnet for ghost hunters, claiming the spirits of dead prisoners still haunted the concrete cells. I'd read the historical records. The jail was a 2-cell structure built in 1905, torn from its original building when mining explosions destabilized the mountainside. Physics, not phantoms. I arrived at sunset with my recording equipment, ready to spend the night documenting how natural sounds and shadows created the illusion of paranormal activity. The jail sat below Hull Avenue, surrounded by an iron fence that was supposed to keep tourists out. I'd gotten permission from a local contact who owed me a favor, someone who thought my exposé would actually help the town by separating fact from fiction. The structure was smaller than I expected. Crumbling concrete walls divided into 2 cells with barred windows and a single barred back door. The left cell was completely open, its front wall missing entirely. The right cell was more intact, just a small hole in the lower wall offering a glimpse inside. I set up my equipment in the open cell as the last light drained from the sky. My thermal camera showed nothing unusual. My EMF detector registered baseline readings. I spoke into my recorder, documenting the temperature, the smell of old concrete, and desert dust, the complete absence of anything supernatural. That's when I heard the first cell door slam. The sound came from the intact cell to my right, metal screeching against metal. I spun toward it, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The cell had no door. I'd seen that myself when I arrived. The front wall was mostly intact with a small hole, but there was no door to slam. I moved closer, crouching to peer through the opening. My light illuminated a concrete slab bed, graffiti scratched into walls, and nothing else. No door, no source for the sound. I was explaining it into my recorder. Old buildings settle, metal contracts in desert cold. When the second door slammed behind me, I turned back to the open cell where my equipment sat. A door now filled the entrance. Solid wood bound with iron straps, a small barred window at eye level. I hadn't seen that door anywhere when I set up. It hadn't been lying on the ground. It hadn't been leaning against a wall. It simply existed now where nothing had been 30 seconds earlier. I grabbed the handle and pulled. It didn't move. I threw my shoulder against it. The wood didn't even shudder. My phone showed no signal. I'd expected that, the mountain. Blocked reception. But I hadn't expected to need it. I was starting to document this new development when I heard the scratching beneath my feet. It started at the back corner of the cell, a rhythmic scraping like fingernails dragging across concrete. The sound moved toward me slowly, deliberately, as if someone was crawling beneath the floor. I stepped back and felt the wall shift. Not dramatically, just a slight tilt that made me catch myself against the concrete. The entire building had moved. I told myself it was my imagination, an equilibrium problem from stress and adrenaline. Then it happened again. A definite shift, the floor angling maybe 2 degrees downward toward the mountain's base. My equipment slid an inch across the concrete. The scratching grew louder, joined by a second source, then a third. Things beneath the building were moving with it. My thermal camera activated on its own, the screen glowing green. I grabbed it and saw them. Heat signatures in humanoid shapes surrounding the jail's exterior. Dozens of them, standing motionless in a perimeter around the building. The camera wasn't malfunctioning. The shapes had definition, individual variations in height and build. They were facing the jail, facing me. I panned the camera toward the door and saw a face pressed against the barred window. The thermal signature showed a man's features in shades of orange and red against the cooler night air. His mouth was moving. I couldn't hear words, but I could see the jaw working, opening and closing in some silent message, or prayer, or accusation. The building shifted again, more noticeably this time. A grinding sound came from beneath the foundation, rocks and earth moving as the entire structure tilted further down the slope. I'd read about the 1938 slide, how dynamite blasts from the mines had destabilized the hillside. But those mines were closed, had been closed for decades. Nothing was blasting underground, nothing natural anyway. The scratching beneath the floor became frantic. Dozens of sources now, clawing and scraping like prisoners, trying to dig their way out of a mass grave. The thermal signatures outside moved closer, their heat pressing against the jail's walls, until I could feel warmth radiating through the concrete despite the desert cold. A voice came from the intact cell next to mine. It spoke my name. Not my podcast name, my legal name that wasn't publicly listed anywhere. The voice was hoarse, damaged, like someone who'd screamed until their throat bled. It asked me why I'd come. It told me the jail never stopped moving, never stopped sliding. It just moved between places I couldn't normally see. The building shifted again, a violent lurch that knocked me to my knees. My equipment crashed against the wall. Through the barred door window, I watched the landscape outside change. The distant lights of Jerome's main street winked out. The paved road disappeared. I was looking at bare mountainside lit by moonlight, the same view someone would have seen in 1938, or earlier. Shadow figures appeared in the cell with me. The thermal camera showed nothing, but my eyes saw them clearly. Men in early 20th century clothing, prison uniforms, and mining clothes, standing against the walls in positions that suggested they'd been there for hours or years. Their faces were hollow, skin pulled tight over skulls, eyes reflecting my flashlight beam like animals. One of them pointed at the floor where the scratching sounds originated. His mouth moved, but the voice came from everywhere, from the concrete itself. He said they'd been buried beneath the jail. Not officially, not in any records, but buried nonetheless. Men who died in the mines, in bar fights, in claim-jumping disputes, dumped in shallow graves before the jail's foundation was poured. The building had locked them in place for decades until the first slide began to free them. The structure lurched forward, actually moving down the slope. I felt it slide, heard rocks breaking beneath the foundation, experienced the sickening sensation of being inside a building in motion. The door in front of me bent inward, wood splintering as if something outside was trying to force its way in. Through the barred window, I saw hands, at least a dozen hands with split nails and torn skin, gripping the bars and pulling. The thermal signatures had surrounded the jail completely, a mob of heat and rage. The voice from the next cell told me they'd been waiting decades for someone to document their existence. Not their ghost stories, not the tourist legend of a sliding jail, but the truth of what was buried and forgotten. The building's movement had torn them loose from the earth, and now they rode with it, sliding between the world of the living and whatever came after, trapped in the motion, just like the structure itself. I don't remember making the decision to break through the back wall. I remember grabbing a piece of my tripod and slamming it against the concrete around the barred back door. The wall was already cracked, already crumbling from decades of movement and weathering. It gave way faster than it should have, chunks falling away like it wanted me out. I squeezed through the opening as the jail lurched again, sliding faster now, picking up momentum. I fell onto the hillside and rolled, feeling gravel tear my skin and cactus spines punch through my clothes. When I stopped rolling and looked back, the jail had moved. Not inches, but at least 20 feet down the slope from where I'd entered it. The thermal signatures stood around it in a perfect circle. They watched me for a long moment, then turned their attention back to the building, their hands reaching toward it like worshippers or prisoners returning to their cells. The jail shuddered once more and then stopped, settling into new position. When I checked my watch, 3 hours had passed since I'd heard the first door slam. It had felt like 20 minutes. My equipment was still inside. I didn't go back for it. I could barely get my keys in the ignition because my hands were shaking so badly. As I drove away, I saw the jail in my rearview mirror, sitting exactly where it had always been, according to every photo and tourist guide, surrounded by its protective fence on Hull Avenue. But I know what I felt. I know the building moved with me inside it, sliding between places that occupy the same space but different times. The scratching beneath the floor still visits me in quiet moments, a reminder that some structures don't just hold prisoners, they become prisons themselves, trapping everything they touch in endless, repetitive motion. I never posted the debunking episode about Jerome. Instead, I deleted my podcast entirely. Some things shouldn't be explained away. Some things should be left to slide through the darkness, carrying their buried secrets wherever they end up. I just pray it's nowhere near me. I thought the gold dust would be harmless. Just a sample. A few grams from the tailings piles outside Vulture City's abandoned mine, something to add authenticity to my collection of Western artifacts. I'd spent months reading about the Vulture Mine, Arizona's richest gold producer, and the infamous hanging tree where 18 men died for stealing high-grade ore in the 1800s. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was committing the same crime they'd been executed for, just on a smaller scale. But those men had stolen pounds of gold. I was taking dust, worthless traces left behind after more than a century of processing and weathering. Nobody would care. Nobody would even notice. I filled a small vial with the glittering powder on a Tuesday afternoon, slipped it into my jacket pocket, and drove away from Vulture City, feeling like I'd gotten away with the perfect victimless crime. The first mark appeared Wednesday morning. I was shaving when I noticed it in the bathroom mirror, a thin red line circling my throat like someone had drawn on my skin with a marker while I slept. The line was perfectly horizontal, positioned exactly where a rope would sit during a hanging. I rubbed at it thinking it was dirt or irritation from my shirt collar. The mark didn't smudge. It didn't fade. When I touched it, the skin felt hot, feverish, like the early stages of a burn. I convinced myself it was an allergic reaction to something, maybe a new laundry detergent or the dust from crawling around Vulture City's ruins. I took antihistamines and went to work, adjusting my collar to hide the mark from my coworkers. By Thursday, I couldn't swallow properly. Every time I tried to eat or drink, my throat constricted like something was wrapped around it, pulling tight. The red mark had darkened to an angry purple, and when I looked closely, I could see the texture of rope fibers imprinted in my skin. Not a rash that looked like rope burns. Actual fiber patterns pressed into my flesh, as if the rope was invisible but still there, still tightening. I went to urgent care. The doctor examined my throat, ran her fingers over the mark, and frowned. She said it looked like ligature marks but couldn't explain how I'd gotten them. She asked if someone had tried to strangle me. I laughed and told her no, which was technically true. No living person had put their hands on me. Friday morning, I couldn't breathe. I woke up gasping, clawing at my throat, feeling phantom rope fibers cutting into my windpipe. The mark had become a deep groove, purple-black bruising spreading above and below it. My neck looked like someone had tried to hang me and failed, leaving me marked but alive. I called in sick to work and spent the day in bed, trying to rationalize what was happening. Stress manifestation, psychosomatic symptoms, some weird infection, anything except the truth that was whispering in the back of my mind, that the gold dust in my jacket pocket was cursed, that the 18 men who died for theft had marked me as one of their own. I got up around noon, found the vial, and stared at it. The gold dust had changed. Instead of glittering yellow, it looked gray and gritty, more like sand than precious metal. That's when I saw them in my bedroom mirror. 18 men standing behind me in a semicircle, their necks bent at impossible angles, rope marks scoring their throats. Some of them looked fresh, like they'd died yesterday, faces purple and swollen. Others were desiccated, skin pulled tight over skulls, clothes rotted to rags. But all of them were watching me with the same expression. Not anger, but recognition. They nodded slowly, as if welcoming me to their club. I spun around and my bedroom was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, they were still there, still watching, one of them pointing at my throat and then at his own. The message was clear. I'd taken what they died for protecting, and now I'd face what they'd faced. Saturday, the rope became visible. I woke to find actual hemp fibers materialized around my neck, rough and brown, and thick enough to see individual strands. They weren't attached to anything. No noose hanging from my ceiling, just a collar of rope that appeared and disappeared randomly throughout the day. When it manifested, I couldn't breathe. My vision would darken at the edges, and I'd feel myself lifted slightly, toes barely touching the floor, experiencing the slow strangulation that the hanged men had endured. They didn't break necks at Vulture City. They used short drops that strangled slowly, taking minutes or hours, leaving bodies to swing and rot in the desert heat as warnings to other potential thieves. I was experiencing every second of those deaths. When the rope vanished, I'd collapse gasping, but the relief only lasted until the next manifestation. I tried to return the gold dust Sunday morning. I drove back to Vulture City with the vial, planning to pour it exactly where I'd found it, to undo what I'd done. But when I opened the vial, the contents had transformed completely. Instead of dust, it was fine sand that poured out like an hourglass, and it wouldn't stop pouring. I emptied the vial, but more sand appeared, flowing continuously from the small glass container. The sand fell onto the tailings pile and immediately blew away in the wind, scattering before it could return to its source. I tried pouring it directly onto the ground, tried mixing it into the original pile, tried everything I could think of. The vial kept producing more sand, and none of it would stay where I put it. The 18 men appeared around me, standing among the ruins of their town, and for the first time, one of them spoke. His voice sounded like wind through a dry throat. He said the gold wasn't what I'd stolen. I'd stolen their suffering, their final moments, their warning to others. Those things couldn't be returned, only experienced. Monday, the sand started coming out of me. I was at my kitchen sink drinking water when I coughed and felt grains in my mouth. I spit into my hand and saw gold-colored sand mixed with saliva. Throughout the day, more sand emerged. From my mouth, my nose, even seeping from my tear ducts. Every time I exhaled, a fine powder of gold dust came with it, glittering in the light before falling to collect around my feet. I swept it up obsessively, but more kept appearing, like my body was full of the stuff and determined to expel every grain. The rope around my neck had become permanent, visible to me at all times, though apparently invisible to everyone else based on the horrified looks people gave my bruised throat, rather than the hemp fibers I could see and feel. By Tuesday, I couldn't leave my house. The sand was pouring from me constantly now, not just when I coughed, but steadily, like I was bleeding gold dust instead of blood. It collected in piles around my furniture, filled my shoes, covered my floors in a glittering layer. The 18 men stood in my living room, watching silently. They didn't need to explain what was happening. I understood. The gold they died protecting had become part of them in death, mixed with their bodies as they rotted beneath the hanging tree or wherever they'd been discarded. I'd taken that gold, and now it was taking me, transforming my living body into the same mixture of flesh and metal and earth that they'd become. The rope tightened incrementally throughout the day, cutting off a little more air each hour, mimicking the slow death they'd experienced. Wednesday morning, I looked dead. My skin had taken on a gray pallor. My lips were purple, my eyes bloodshot from the pressure of strangulation. Gold dust filled my lungs, and every breath was agony, like inhaling ground glass. I tried to call for help but could only produce a whistle, the sound of air forced through a throat too swollen to properly function. The men were closer now, standing in a tight circle around me, their rope-scarred necks level with my eyeline. One of them reached out and touched the vial I'd left on my nightstand. His finger passed through it like smoke, but I understood the gesture. The vial was empty. Had been empty since Sunday, but I was still full of what I'd taken. The gold, the guilt, the punishment. All of it had transferred from that container into me. I'm writing this Thursday afternoon with hands that shake and leave gold dust fingerprints on every surface I touch. The rope is so tight now I can barely see, barely think. The 18 men stand vigil around me, patient as they've been for over a century. They're not punishing me out of malice. They're simply sharing what was done to them, making sure I understand what theft cost them and what it will cost me. The sand is piling up around my feet. Gold dust that used to be part of me now, forming small dunes on my bedroom floor. I wonder if I'll become like them, a ghost bound to Vulture City, standing among the ruins and watching for the next person who thinks they can take something that doesn't belong to them. The mine produced over 340,000 ounces of gold, but half of it was stolen by high-graders who thought they'd never face consequences. 18 of them hanged. How many more became like me, marked and transformed and absorbed into the desert? How many of us are there, walking around with rope burns and lungs full of gold dust, slowly becoming part of the curse? I can't warn anyone because I can't speak anymore. The rope has stolen my voice, like it stole my breath. All I can do is wait for the final tightening, the moment when the phantom hemp becomes real enough to finish what it started. The men are nodding now, their broken necks bobbing in approval. They know I've learned the lesson. Some treasures aren't meant to be taken. Some gold carries the weight of every death it caused, and that weight will drag you down into the earth, where you'll wait your turn to pass it on. The hanging tree is still standing in Vulture City, and beneath it are bodies that were never properly buried, thieves who became part of the ground they stole from. I think I'm about to join them, one grain of gold dust at a time. The smoke shouldn't exist. That's what I kept thinking as I crawled deeper into the Apache death cave at 2 guns, my camera equipment scraping against limestone walls that hadn't seen sunlight in decades. I was documenting abandoned Route 66 sites for a coffee table book, and 2 guns was perfect. Crumbling gas stations, fake Pueblo ruins built to trick tourists, and this cave where 42 Apache warriors supposedly died in 1878 when Navajo attackers filled it with burning sagebrush. The locals warned me not to enter after sunset, but golden hour light was fading, and I needed those dramatic shadows for my shots. I'd been inside maybe 10 minutes when I smelled it. Smoke, not stale residue from century-old fires, but fresh smoke, acrid and hot, making my eyes water. My headlamp cut through gray haze that hadn't been there 30 seconds earlier, and somewhere deeper in the cave system, I heard voices speaking in a language I didn't understand. I turned to leave, and the cave entrance was gone. Where I'd crawled in through a narrow opening surrounded by graffiti and beer cans, there was now solid rock wall. I ran my hands over it, feeling for seams or cracks, finding nothing but smooth limestone that had clearly been there for centuries. My phone showed 6:47 p.m. but no signal, which I'd expected. What I hadn't expected was the timestamp to change while I watched it. 6:47 became 6:12, then jumped to 7:23, then back to 5:58. Time wasn't flowing correctly in the cave, and neither was space, because the tunnel I'd just crawled through had somehow rearranged itself behind me. The voices grew louder, shouting now, and I heard horses screaming the way they do when they're dying. The smoke thickened until I was coughing, dropping to my knees where the air was clearer, and that's when I saw the first body. He was Apache, dressed in 1870s clothing, lying on his side with his throat cut. Not a skeleton, not a corpse that had been there for over a century, but a fresh body still bleeding onto the cave floor. His eyes were open, staring at nothing, and his mouth moved. Words came out in English, though his lips didn't match the sounds. He said I was too late to warn them, that the Navajo had already sealed the entrance, and the smoke was coming. Then he dissolved into gray ash that swirled in the air and reformed into a different person. Me, lying in the same position with my throat cut, my camera smashed beside my head. I scrambled backward and hit someone standing behind me. I spun around and saw a Navajo warrior with a rifle, his face twisted in rage, and before I could scream, he brought the rifle butt down toward my skull. I felt the impact, felt bone crack, and vision explode into white pain, and then I was standing again, uninjured, watching myself lying on the cave floor with my head caved in while that same Navajo warrior stood over my body. The smoke cleared for a moment, and I was somewhere else in the cave system, deeper than I'd been, surrounded by terrified people huddled against walls. Apache warriors tried to calm horses that were panicking from smoke inhalation. Children cried. Women prayed. I tried to speak, to ask what was happening, but my mouth moved on its own, and Apache words came out. Words I somehow understood, even though I'd never learned the language. I was asking about the girls, the 3 Navajo captives, whether they were still alive. An older warrior answered that they'd already been killed, that there would be no negotiating with the Navajo now, that this cave would become their tomb. Smoke poured in from the entrance, thick and choking, and I felt it fill my lungs. I was dying, suffocating, experiencing every second of respiratory failure as my body desperately tried to extract oxygen from air that had become pure carbon monoxide and particulate matter. Then I was outside the cave, standing in desert darkness with 40 other Navajo warriors. We'd found them. The scouts had felt heat rising from a vent in the ground, heard voices echoing from below, and now we'd blocked the only entrance with burning sagebrush and dead wood. The fire roared in the cave mouth, and anyone who tried to escape would die on our arrows or bullets. I was simultaneously myself and someone else, experiencing their memories and motivations, understanding their grief and rage over the murdered village, over the 3 tortured girls. Part of me screamed that this was wrong, that I didn't belong here, that this had happened 147 years ago. But another part of me knew the girls' names, had found their bodies, and wanted nothing except to make the Apaches suffer for what they'd done. I watched the cave entrance for hours, saw smoke curl out of vents in the ground, heard screams that gradually faded to silence. When we finally entered the cave, we found 42 dead Apache and their slaughtered horses lying in pools of blood where they'd cut the animals' throats trying to use the liquid to dampen cloths against the smoke. I was inside again, one of those horses, feeling the blade across my throat, tasting my own blood as I drowned in it while smoke burned my eyes and lungs. I was an Apache child who'd never raided anyone, never hurt anyone, dying because of decisions made by warriors I barely knew. I was a Navajo scout who found the heat vent, whose discovery led to the massacre, carrying the weight of 42 deaths for the rest of my life. I was all of them simultaneously, experiencing the massacre from every perspective, every victim and killer, every moment of terror and rage and grief compressed into an eternal loop that my mind couldn't process or escape. The cave kept resetting, kept forcing me back to different positions in the sequence. Sometimes I died in the smoke. Sometimes I died from a slit throat. Sometimes I survived and had to live with what I'd done. But I was never myself. I was never the photographer who'd entered a tourist attraction to take pictures. That person had dissolved into the massacre the moment the smoke appeared, absorbed into the trauma that soaked the limestone walls. The exit appeared 3 times. I saw it clearly. Bright desert sunset beyond a narrow opening, exactly where I'd entered hours or minutes or days ago. Time had stopped meaning anything. But each time I crawled toward it, the cave rearranged itself. Tunnels branched in directions that hadn't existed, leading deeper into the earth instead of out. I'd find myself back at the main chamber where the bodies had been, except sometimes the bodies were Apache and sometimes they were tourists from different eras. Modern people in jeans and t-shirts who'd made the same mistake I had. They flickered in and out of existence, trapped in their own loops, experiencing their own versions of the massacre. A man from the 1950s kept reliving his death by mountain lion, attacked by Harry Miller's escaped zoo animals in tunnels that shouldn't connect to the surface. A woman from the 1970s burned over and over in a fire that consumed the Route 66 buildings above, smoke seeping down into the cave and recreating the original massacre. We were all caught in the same web of violence, our individual traumas merged with the historical event until there was no separation between what had happened in 1878 and what was happening now. I lost track of how many times I died. Smoke inhalation at least 20 iterations. Throat cut by Apache trying to use my blood like they'd used their horses, a dozen times. Shot by Navajo warriors when I tried to flee, countless iterations. Each death felt completely real, pain and terror, and the desperate biological fight for survival before darkness took over. Then I'd reset, whole and uninjured, in a different location with a different perspective. Sometimes I was white, sometimes Apache, sometimes Navajo. Sometimes I spoke English, sometimes languages I'd never learned, but somehow understood. The cave was showing me every version of the violence it contained, making me experience every drop of suffering that had soaked into the limestone. My camera was gone. My phone was gone. My identity was fragmenting into pieces, each piece belonging to a different victim of the massacre or the curse that came after. The voices in Apache changed to English and back randomly, words overlapping until I couldn't distinguish individual speakers from the chorus of the dead. They told me the cave had never released anyone who entered after dark. The 42 Apache hadn't been the first to die here, just the largest group at once. The limestone formation had witnessed violence for thousands of years, absorbed it, become addicted to it. When Harry Miller turned it into a tourist attraction in the 1920s, he fed the cave more death, his murder of Earl Cundiff, the tourists who fell and broke their necks in the darkness, the animals that escaped his zoo and died in the tunnels. Every violent death added another loop, another perspective, another way for the cave to trap and replay suffering. I was just the latest addition, my fear and confusion becoming part of the permanent collection, ready to be experienced by whoever entered next. I found the exit again, when time read 3:47 a.m. on a phone that should have died hours ago, but somehow still glowed with battery power. The opening was there, real and solid, showing starlit desert instead of sunset. I crawled toward it on hands and knees, not trusting it to stay real, expecting the cave to shift and trap me again. My fingers touched open air. Cool night breeze hit my face. I dragged myself out of the cave entrance and collapsed on dirt, coughing smoke that shouldn't exist from lungs that had died dozens of times. When I could finally stand, I looked back at the cave. The entrance I'd used was sealed with old boards and warning signs, clearly blocked off for years. I'd entered through a completely different opening half a mile away, or at least I thought I had, but my memory of the entrance kept changing, showing me different locations, different years, different versions of two guns from different eras. My car was where I'd left it near the old gas station ruins, except it wasn't. The paint was more faded, the tires partially deflated, a thick layer of dust covering everything, like it had been parked there for weeks instead of hours. The photos on my camera showed images I hadn't taken. Pictures from the 1950s, the 1970s, the 1990s, tourists posing at two guns in eras I'd never visited. My last time-stamped photo from before entering the cave was dated 2019, 3 years before I'd actually arrived. Time had fractured around me, and I'd experienced more of it inside the cave than had passed in the outside world, or maybe less. Or maybe it had all happened simultaneously in some quantum nightmare I couldn't begin to understand. I drove away from two guns at 4:12 a.m. watching the ruins disappear in my rearview mirror, and somewhere in the darkness I heard horses screaming and smelled smoke from fires that had burned out 147 years ago but never really stopped. The Apache Death Cave killed 42 people in 1878, or maybe it didn't, or maybe the massacre was invented by Harry Miller to sell tickets, or maybe it was real and continues to be real in an eternal present tense where victims experience their deaths forever. I don't know anymore. What I know is that I spent 3 hours, or 3 days, or 3 years trapped in that cave, dying over and over, becoming everyone who'd ever suffered there. The book project is abandoned. I can't look at photos of Route 66 without seeing smoke, can't smell campfires without tasting blood, can't sleep without waking up choking on air that's clear but feels like it's full of burning sagebrush. Sometimes I check my throat for cuts that aren't there. Sometimes I check my skull for fractures that healed without leaving scars. The massacre is still happening, will always be happening, in a cave where time loops and violence never dies. And somewhere in those loops, a version of me is still trapped there, still crawling toward exits that move, still dying in 42 different ways, adding my suffering to the collection. If you ever see two guns from I-40, keep driving. The exit is marked, easy to find, but some exits only lead deeper into places you'll never leave. The handprints appeared on the schoolhouse windows before I even entered the building. Small prints, child-sized, pressed against dusty glass from the inside like kids waving goodbye to their parents. That should have been my first warning, but I was exhausted from the drive to Ruby and desperate for shade in the brutal Arizona heat. I'd taken a sabbatical from teaching after 15 years of burning out in overcrowded classrooms, and I was spending my summer documenting historical one-room schoolhouses across the West. Ruby's school was supposedly one of the best preserved, a 3-room structure that had served up to 1,200 mining families before the town emptied in 1941. I parked near the building and grabbed my notebook, already composing the essay I'd write about frontier education and the spaces where children learned despite harsh conditions and isolation. The door was unlocked, which surprised me, given Ruby's location on private property. Inside, the schoolhouse felt wrong immediately, not threatening, but urgent, like I'd walked into a space where something important was about to happen. 3 classrooms connected by open doorways, desks still arranged in neat rows, chalkboards mounted on walls that hadn't seen lessons in 84 years. But the temperature was off. Outside, it was pushing 105 degrees. Inside, the air felt cold enough to raise goosebumps on my arms. And the dust that covered every surface in the other Ruby buildings was absent here. The floors looked swept. The desks looked recently used, pencil grooves, and carved initials fresh enough to have been made yesterday instead of decades ago. I ran my finger across a desk, and it came away clean. That's when I heard the singing. Children's voices, maybe a dozen of them, chanting something rhythmic, like a schoolyard rhyme. The words were unclear, but the melody was insistent, repetitive, building in volume until I could make out the lyrics. Don't go near the store. Don't go near the store. Something waits behind the door. Don't go near the store. I spun around and the middle classroom was full of children. Not solid, not quite transparent, but present in the way heat shimmer makes distant objects waver. They sat at desks with their hands folded, staring at me with expressions that weren't frightening. They were pleading. A girl in the front row, maybe 8 years old, wearing a 1930s dress, pointed toward the window that faced the Ruby Mercantile building across the dusty road. She shook her head violently, then pointed at me, then at the door leading out of the schoolhouse. The message was clear. Leave. Don't go toward the store. I'm a teacher. I've spent 15 years reading children's body language, understanding what they can't articulate, recognizing genuine fear versus performance. These ghost children were terrified. Not of me, but for me. The girl in the front row stood up and walked toward me, her shoes making no sound on the wooden floor. She reached out like she wanted to grab my hand, and when her fingers passed through mine, I felt ice water shock and a rush of information that wasn't mine. I saw the schoolhouse from her perspective, saw children playing at recess while teachers monitored from the porch, saw normal life in a mining town where families worked hard and children learned arithmetic and reading between helping their parents. But I also saw the store, the Ruby Mercantile, where her father worked, where violence had happened multiple times between 1920 and 1922. 6 people murdered by bandits, including store owners and their families. But the murders weren't the worst thing. Something else was there, something that had fed on the violence and grown strong enough to remain after everyone left. The children started moving my belongings. My notebook flew off the desk where I'd set it and landed near the door. My car keys, which I'd put in my pocket, materialized on the floor, creating a path toward the exit. A boy pointed at my camera bag, and it tipped over, spilling equipment toward the doorway like a trail leading out. They were physically manipulating objects, using what little energy they had to herd me away from the building. The girl who'd touched me grabbed my sleeve. I felt pressure this time, weak but present, and pulled. She was crying, transparent tears that evaporated before they reached her chin. Behind her, the other children had arranged themselves in a line blocking the doorway that faced the mercantile. They were creating a barrier between me and that building, sacrificing their own ability to appear solid to maintain the blockade. I should have listened. I should have gathered my equipment and left Ruby immediately. But I'm a rational person who spent 15 years dealing with real problems. Budget cuts and standardized tests, and parents who blame teachers for their kids' failures. I don't believe in ghosts protecting people from unseen threats. I believed I was experiencing heat exhaustion and dehydration, that my mind was creating elaborate hallucinations from stress and fatigue. So I did exactly what the children were begging me not to do. I walked toward the door facing the mercantile, intending to splash water on my face from my car and sit in air conditioning until my head cleared. The children's blockade tried to hold me back. I felt small hands pushing against my legs and torso, felt cold spots where their bodies intersected with mine, heard them screaming that single word over and over. Don't, don't, don't. I pushed through them and stepped onto the schoolhouse porch. The Ruby Mercantile stood maybe 200 feet away, a large adobe structure with empty windows and a collapsed roof section. Normal ghost town ruins, dangerous because of structural instability but nothing supernatural. Except it wasn't normal. Now that I was outside, I could see what the children had seen. The building's shadow was wrong. The sun was directly overhead, creating short shadows that pooled at the base of structures. But the mercantile's shadow stretched toward me, extending far beyond the physical laws of light and distance. It was reaching for the schoolhouse, for me, a darkness that moved independently of its source. And inside that darkness, something massive shifted position. The children poured out of the schoolhouse, surrounding me in a protective circle. They faced outward toward the mercantile, their small bodies forming a perimeter. The girl who'd touched me stood directly in front of me, arms spread wide despite being half my size and completely dead. She was shielding me. They all were. The shadow stopped advancing, held back by whatever force the children possessed. I could see shapes moving in the darkness now, multiple forms that were too large to be human and too purposeful to be random. They prowled the perimeter of the mercantile, testing the boundaries, searching for weaknesses in the children's defense. One of the shapes brushed against the nearest child, a boy of maybe 10, and he flickered out of existence. Didn't scream, didn't fade gradually. He was simply erased. The other children tightened their circle, closing the gap, but I could feel their fear radiating like cold fire. A voice came from the mercantile. Not words exactly, but meaning transmitted directly into my consciousness, the same way the girl's touch had transferred information. It asked me to come inside, said it had been waiting since the murders, feeding on the violence that had soaked into adobe walls, growing stronger with each year of isolation. It needed something alive to consume, something warm and full of fear. The bandits had fed it temporarily, but that nourishment had run out decades ago. The children who died in Ruby, from disease, accidents, the normal childhood mortality of mining towns, had recognized the thing and formed a guard, protecting visitors who came to photograph ruins and document history. For 80 years, they'd maintained their watch, draining their own energy to keep the thing contained in the mercantile. But they were weakening. The boy who'd vanished had used his last reserves to help hold the line. More children were flickering, their forms becoming transparent and unstable. The girl in front of me looked back, and I saw exhaustion in her dead face, the weight of 8 decades spent fighting something they couldn't destroy. She couldn't speak, but her eyes communicated everything. Run. Take my car keys and drive away, and don't look back. Let them use their remaining strength to hold the shadow long enough for me to escape. After I was gone, they'd fail. The thing would break free from the mercantile and spread across Ruby, then beyond, hunting for the living warmth it craved. But that wasn't my problem. I was alive and could save myself, and that's all that mattered. I stayed, not out of courage, but because I'd spent 15 years teaching children who needed protection, and I couldn't abandon these kids even if they were 80 years dead. I pulled out my phone and started taking photos of the mercantile, documenting what the children faced. The flash seemed to hurt the shadow. It recoiled from the light, pulling back toward the building. The children saw what I was doing and understood. They broke formation and ran toward my car, their forms solidifying enough to open doors and activate the headlights. High beams cut across the distance between the schoolhouse and mercantile, creating a barrier of light. The shadow writhed and contracted, unable to cross the illuminated space. More children appeared, kids I hadn't seen before, joining the defense. They'd been conserving energy, hiding in Ruby's other buildings, but now they committed everything they had left. The thing in the mercantile screamed, not a sound I heard with ears, but a frequency that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. It threw itself against the light barrier, testing it, and where it touched the beams, it burned. Not fire, but dissolution, the darkness becoming less substantial. The children maintained the headlights, while I continued photographing with flash, creating multiple light sources from different angles. We were driving it back, forcing it deeper into the mercantile ruins. The girl grabbed my hand. Solid now, I could feel her skin, and together we walked toward the store. The other children followed, maintaining their circle, pushing the shadow back with their presence and the artificial light I provided. When we reached the mercantile entrance, the thing made one final attempt to break through. It surged forward and took 3 more children, erasing them like they'd never existed. But the rest held firm, and I aimed my phone's light directly into the building's interior. The thing that looked back at me wasn't an entity, it was an absence. A hole in space shaped like hunger, a void that had learned to move and think and hunt. It had been growing since the first murders in 1920, feeding on violence and death until it became substantial enough to exist independently. The children had been fighting it since the town emptied, preventing it from leaving Ruby and finding fresh victims. They'd sacrificed their ability to move on, to rest, to escape their own deaths, because they understood what would happen if this thing reached a populated area. Now it was trapped by light and determination, compressed back into the deepest shadows of the collapsed store. The girl squeezed my hand and nodded. Together we'd won, temporarily, but it wouldn't last. The children were fading. My phone battery was dying. Eventually the thing would break free. I burned the mercantile, used every flammable material I could find in Ruby, old furniture, paper, wooden debris, and created a pyre that consumed the building and everything it contained. The fire burned for 3 hours in the afternoon heat, adobe walls cracking and collapsing, shadows destroyed by flames that were too bright to allow darkness any space to exist. The children watched from the schoolhouse porch, their forms almost invisible in the daylight but still present. When the mercantile finally collapsed into ash and rubble, the girl appeared beside me one last time. She was smiling, her lips moved, and I heard words inside my mind rather than through air. "Thank you. Tell them we protected everyone as long as we could." Then she faded completely, taking the other children with her. The cold spots disappeared from the schoolhouse. The urgent feeling evaporated. Ruby became just another ghost town with empty buildings and historical significance. I reported the fire to authorities as an accident, my car backfiring near dry brush, and paid for the damage. The owners accepted my explanation and insurance money without question. I never told them what really burned. That I'd destroyed the last remnant of something that had killed 6 people and would have killed countless more if a group of dead children hadn't sacrificed their peace to hold it prisoner. The schoolhouse still stands in Ruby. Windows clear of handprints, floors covered in natural dust. No children sing warnings about the store anymore because the store is gone, and so are they, finally allowed to rest after 80 years of guard duty. I finished my sabbatical, but never returned to teaching. How could I, knowing what I know? That children protect us even in death, that they give everything they have to keep us safe, and we rarely notice until it's too late to thank them. Ruby taught me what the schoolhouse couldn't, that some lessons are written in sacrifice, and some ghosts aren't trying to scare you. They're trying to save you from things far worse than death. The photograph shouldn't have existed. I found it in the Chloride Historical Society archives while researching my great-great-grandfather, a silver mine owner named Samuel Torrens, who'd made his fortune in Arizona's 1870s boom. The photo showed a group of miners standing outside the Tennessee mine entrance in 1873, and there in the center, wearing a fine suit and holding surveying equipment, stood a man with my face. Not similar features or family resemblance, my exact face, down to the small scar above my left eyebrow, from a childhood accident that hadn't happened yet in 1873. I'd come to Chloride to photograph ancestral sites for a family tree project, to stand where Samuel had stood and document our lineage. Looking at that photograph, I realized Samuel had already been expecting me. The way he stared directly at the camera, the hint of a smile on his lips, the possessive way his hand rested on mining equipment. He looked like a man waiting for something he knew would eventually arrive. I should have left Chloride that afternoon. Instead, I walked the town looking for Samuel's mine, following a hand-drawn map from 1874 that showed his primary claim in the hills east of town. The mine entrance had collapsed decades ago, sealed with modern fencing and warning signs, but the superintendent's cabin remained intact nearby. The door hung open on broken hinges, inviting me inside despite every rational instinct screaming that I should return to my car. The cabin's interior was surprisingly preserved. A cot with rotted blankets, a desk covered in mining ledgers, personal items scattered, as if the occupant had stepped out momentarily and never returned. On the desk positioned where I couldn't miss it, was a framed daguerreotype of a woman and child. The woman was a stranger, but the child's face was mine again. That same impossible replication staring out from the 1870s. The air in the cabin felt thick, almost liquid, like pushing through water. I photographed everything: the desk, the ledgers, the personal effects, documenting Samuel's life. That's when I noticed my camera's display showing images I hadn't taken. Between my photos were others, older images in sepia tones showing the cabin fully furnished, candles lit, a fire burning in the hearth. In these phantom images, a man sat at the desk writing letters, and in every frame his head was turned toward the camera, toward me, as if he'd been photographed while watching something just outside the frame. The man was Samuel. His expression in each image was expectant, almost eager, like a parent watching a child return home after a long absence. I tried to leave and found the cabin door wouldn't open. Not locked, not jammed, but simply refusing to move, despite having swung freely when I entered. The windows were barred from the outside, thick iron rods I hadn't noticed before, or perhaps hadn't existed before. The temperature dropped sharply, my breath fogging in air that had been sweltering. Desert heat moments earlier. Samuel appeared sitting at his desk, not transparent or flickering like the ghost children in Ruby, but solid and real as if he'd always been there, and I'd simply failed to notice. He was writing in a ledger, his pen scratching across paper that had rotted away decades ago, but appeared fresh and new. Without looking up, he spoke in a voice that sounded like wind through mine tunnels. He said he'd been waiting for me since 1874, the year he died in a cave-in that buried 3 miners and half his fortune. He'd known I would come eventually because he'd seen my face in fever dreams the night before the accident, seen his descendant standing exactly where I stood now. He finally looked at me, and his eyes held an emotion I couldn't classify, not malice, but ownership, the way someone looks at property they've acquired. He explained that the Tennessee mine had produced over 200,000 ounces of silver during his lifetime, making him the wealthiest man in chloride. But wealth meant nothing if there was no heir to inherit it, no family to carry his legacy forward. His wife and son had died of scarlet fever in 1872. He'd spent his remaining 2 years obsessing over bloodline, over finding someone worthy to receive what he'd built. When the mine collapsed and trapped him, he'd made a choice in those final moments before suffocation. He'd refused to die completely. He'd bound himself to this place, to his claim, waiting for family to arrive. And now, after 151 years, his descendant had finally come home. Samuel stood and walked around the desk, his boots solid against wooden floorboards. He touched my shoulder, and I felt weight, temperature, the physical pressure of a dead man's hand. He was showing me things through that touch. Mine shafts filled with silver ore that still glittered in the darkness, underground chambers where he'd hidden his richest finds, locations of treasure that had never been discovered because he'd died before filing the claims. He was trying to seduce me with wealth, with legacy, with the promise of inheriting what he'd died protecting. All I had to do was stay, become the heir he'd waited for, take my rightful place as owner of the Tennessee mine and everything Samuel had accumulated. He'd spent a century and a half alone, and he wouldn't spend another day that way now that I'd arrived. I told him I wasn't staying, that I had a life elsewhere, that I'd only come to photograph sites for a genealogy project. Samuel smiled the way a parent smiles at a child's naive declaration. He said people don't choose where they belong. Blood chooses for them. The mine had called to me across generations, pulling me to chloride through genealogical research and historical curiosity, using my own interests to bring me home. He gestured toward the desk, where mining deeds had appeared. Yellow documents with my name, not Samuel's name, mine, written in his handwriting at the top. He'd been preparing the inheritance, transfer for 151 years, updating the paperwork each decade as if I might arrive at any moment. The deeds conveyed ownership of 3 mines, 200 acres of claims, and mineral rights that would make me wealthy beyond measure if I accepted them. Things began appearing around me. Mining tools materialized leaning against walls, pickaxes, lanterns, surveying equipment, all positioned where I could reach them. Vintage clothing appeared draped over the cot, suits in my size, cut in 1870s style. Books about silver extraction and metallurgy stacked themselves on shelves, their pages opening to sections Samuel had annotated with notes like, "Teach the heir this process first," and "Fundamental knowledge required." He was preparing me, grooming me to take over operations that had ceased in 1944 but continued in whatever space Samuel occupied. He spoke constantly while these things manifested, telling me about yields and ore quality and the best techniques for following silver veins through granite. His voice held pride and affection, the way fathers talk to sons they're training to run family businesses. I noticed photographs appearing on the walls, images of me that I'd never posed for, pictures of myself standing at mine entrances I hadn't visited, operating equipment I'd never touched, wearing the vintage clothes that had materialized in the cabin. In these phantom photographs, I looked comfortable, settled, like I'd been living in chloride for years instead of hours. Samuel saw me staring at the images and explained that time worked differently for him now. He existed in multiple moments simultaneously, seeing past and present and future as a single continuous experience. To him, I'd already accepted the inheritance and stayed. These photos were simply documentation of what would be, what must be, because blood always returned home eventually. The cabin began filling with objects that shouldn't fit in the small space. Ore carts, drilling equipment, furniture from the 1870s. All of Samuel's possessions crowding together until I was pressed against the wall. He was building his world around me, layer by layer, making it impossible to leave even if the door opened. He pulled out more ledgers and began showing me financial records, pointing at numbers with fingers that left smudges on paper that had turned to dust decades ago. He detailed every ounce of silver extracted, every dollar earned, calculating compound interest over 151 years, until the numbers became meaningless abstractions. This was my inheritance, he insisted, the fortune he'd died protecting. The mine collapse hadn't been an accident. It had been claim jumpers trying to steal what was his. He'd stayed behind to guard it. And now that I was here, we could work the claims together. Family, he said, his voice thick with emotion, should never be separated. I found my car keys, moved to the desk drawer, nested among Samuel's personal effects like they'd always belonged there. My phone showed no signal and was losing battery despite being fully charged an hour earlier. Time on the screen kept changing. 5:30 p.m., then 3:47 p.m., then 11:15 a.m., cycling through hours randomly, as if chloride existed in all times simultaneously. Through the cabin window, I could see the town changing too, buildings shifting between ruined and intact, horses appearing on streets that moments before had been empty, people in period clothing walking past before dissolving into heat shimmer. Samuel was pulling me into his temporal space, the elastic present he occupied where 1873 and 2025 were equally real and accessible. He became more insistent as the cabin filled with possessions. He showed me daguerreotypes of the wife and son he'd lost, then showed me modern photographs that portrayed me with a family I didn't have, a wife in pioneer dress, children playing near the mine. He was creating a complete life for me, filling in every detail, manufacturing a history where I'd always been in chloride, always been his heir, always been family. His voice shifted from pride to desperation. He said he'd been so alone, that waiting had been agony, that every year without an heir had been a form of dying that never ended. Now that I was here, he couldn't let me leave. Wouldn't let me leave. The mine needed an owner. The legacy needed a carrier. He needed family. I broke the window. Used a mining pick that had materialized near the desk and shattered glass and iron bars that shouldn't have broken but did, as if my desperation was stronger than Samuel's possession. I threw myself through the opening, feeling broken glass tear my skin, and hit desert ground hard enough to knock the air from my lungs. Samuel appeared at the broken window, leaning out, reaching for me with both arms. His face showed betrayal, the wounded expression of a father rejected by his child. He couldn't follow me outside the cabin. His power was territorial, bound to structures he'd owned in life. But his voice followed me as I ran toward my car, telling me I'd come back, that blood always returned, that the inheritance waited whenever I was ready to accept my place. My car started on the third try, the engine coughing like it had been sitting for years instead of hours. I drove out of Chloride without looking back, but the rearview mirror showed Samuel standing in the middle of the road, watching me leave with an expression of infinite patience. He'd waited 151 years. He could wait longer. The cuts from the broken window healed within days, but other things followed me home. Antique jewelry appeared in my apartment. A silver pocket watch engraved with Samuel's initials, a ring sized perfectly for my finger. Mining documents showed up in my mailbox, deeds with my name in handwriting that matched the ledgers from 1873. Photographs appeared in my phone's gallery, images I never took showing me back in Chloride, standing outside the Tennessee mine, looking like I belonged there. I moved to a different city, changed my number, tried to distance myself from the genealogy project that had led me to Arizona. But Samuel's persistence transcends geography. I find his daguerreotype face in crowds, always watching, always waiting. I smell silver ore dust in my apartment. I wake up with dirt under my fingernails like I've been digging in mines while I sleep. He's calling me home, using the blood connection between us as a tether that stretches across distance and time. The inheritance waits in Chloride, guarded by a ghost who spent 151 years preparing for an heir. Sometimes, in dreams, I see the Tennessee mine reopening, silver glittering in the walls, and Samuel standing at the entrance with his arms spread wide in welcome. He's telling me that family belongs together, that wealth should pass to descendants, that I can't run from blood and legacy and the claim that bears my name in a dead man's handwriting. Chloride never releases its children, he whispers, and I'm his whether I accept it or not. The telegraph shouldn't be working. I stood in Fairbanks' abandoned railroad depot staring at the Western Union machine mounted on the operator's desk, watching its brass key tap out code in steady rhythm. The building had been empty since 1973, the railroad long defunct, the telegraph lines cut decades ago. Yet here it was, clicking away in the silence of a ghost town afternoon, transmitting messages from nowhere to nobody. I'd come to Fairbank as part of my volunteer work, documenting Arizona's abandoned train stations for the Historical Society. 32 years of railway employment, giving me enough expertise to recognize authentic equipment when I saw it. This telegraph was genuine 1910s era Western Union, but it had no power source, no connection to any network, and absolutely no reason to be functioning. Still, it clicked steadily, and my brain, trained through decades of railway work, automatically translated the Morse code into English. Wreck incoming. Stop Fairbank Station. Stop 27 dead stop. I checked the building thoroughly, looking for speakers or hidden devices, some historical society trick to make the depot more atmospheric for visitors. Nothing. The telegraph sat on a dust-covered desk in a room that clearly hadn't been maintained in years, surrounded by decaying ledgers and rotting furniture. No batteries, no solar panels, no visible power source. When I examined the telegraph key more closely, I saw it moving on its own, depressing and releasing with mechanical precision as if invisible fingers operated it. The clicking continued. Warning Fairbank. Stop derailment, imminent, stop check, Southern Rails, stop. I wrote down the messages in my notebook, hands shaking slightly, telling myself this was impossible while simultaneously accepting that it was happening. The message repeated several times, then changed. The telegraph fell silent for exactly 30 seconds before starting again with different content. Operator acknowledge. Stop this. Is Benson Central stop? Do you copy Fairbank? I didn't respond because I had no idea how to operate a telegraph, and because responding to ghost messages seemed like opening a door I didn't want to walk through. The machine didn't care about my silence. It continued transmitting, growing more urgent with each iteration. Fairbank Station. Acknowledge. Stop lives. At risk. Stop must inspect track immediately. Stop. The clicking grew faster, more insistent, and then it did something that made my stomach drop. It started using my name. Richardson. Acknowledge. Stop Thomas. Richardson. Former Benson. Operator. Stop, we know you are there. Stop. Nobody in Fairbank knew I'd worked out of Benson Station for 15 years before my transfer to Tucson. I hadn't told anyone, hadn't put it in any of my historical society documentation. The information was public record somewhere, buried in personnel files, but it wasn't knowledge that should be accessible to a telegraph machine operating without power in an abandoned building. The depot's wall clock started moving. It had been frozen at 3:47 since I'd entered. Hands rusted in place, but now they jerked backward, clicking counterclockwise in steady increments. 3:47 became 3:15, became 2:30, became 1:18, the mechanism grinding against decades of decay. The afternoon sunlight streaming through broken windows changed angle, shadows shifting as if time itself was reversing. I heard sounds outside, a steam whistle, voices shouting railway terminology, the metallic screech of brakes engaging. Through the window, I saw the tracks that had been empty and overgrown with weeds suddenly occupied by a train. Not a modern train, but a 1910-era steam locomotive with passenger cars, pulling into Fairbank Station exactly as it would have done 115 years ago. The engineer leaned from the cab, waving at the depot, clearly expecting someone to acknowledge his arrival. I could see him perfectly, could see passengers in period clothing moving behind the car windows, could read the painted number on the locomotive side, 247. The telegraph became frantic. Train 247, approaching stop, track damage, south of station. Stop must stop the train. Stop Richardson. You know this protocol. Stop, I did know the protocol. 32 years of railway work had drilled emergency procedures into my bones. You flag the train. You activate emergency signals. You do everything possible to prevent a wreck when track damage is reported. But this train wasn't real. It was a ghost, a temporal echo, something that had happened over a century ago. Stopping it was impossible because it had already happened. Already crashed, already killed 27 people in a derailment that I could probably find documented in historical records if I checked. The telegraph knew this. The messages made it clear. This wasn't a warning about a present danger. It was a replaying of warnings from 1910, messages sent by Benson Central to Fairbank Station on the day of the wreck. Except the messages kept changing in ways that suggested they were aware of present circumstances. Richardson. Your shadow is doubled. Stop you stand in 2 times. Stop the wreck is now stop. I looked down and saw what the telegraph described. My shadow on the depot floor wasn't single, but overlaid. 2 silhouettes occupying the same space, but slightly offset. One wearing modern clothes, and one wearing what appeared to be a 1910s railway operator's uniform. I watched both shadows move when I moved, but they didn't move identically. One shadow gestured towards the telegraph, while the other reached for something I couldn't see, mimicking actions I wasn't performing. The temporal bleeding was getting worse. Fairbank existed in 2 moments simultaneously, and I was experiencing both, standing in the abandoned 2025 depot while simultaneously occupying the functional 1910 station. The telegraph shifted to direct address. Thomas, you were operator on duty. Stop, you received the warning. Stop, you did not stop the train. Stop, 27. Dead. Stop, your fault. Stop, that was wrong. I hadn't been alive in 1910, hadn't worked at Fairbanks Station, hadn't failed to prevent any disaster. But my doubled shadow suggested otherwise. One of my shadows was reaching for signal equipment that didn't exist in my present, throwing levers and pulling chains that my physical body couldn't see. I was experiencing someone else's memories, someone else's failure, the guilt of an operator who'd received warnings about track damage and hadn't acted fast enough. The telegraph provided details with each message. Southbound rails washed out by flash flood. Stop warning received, 2:47 p.m. Stop train. 2:47 arrived, 3:19 p.m. Stop. Operator delay caused wreck. Stop train. 2:47 was pulling away from the station now, building steam, heading south along tracks I could see perfectly despite them being overgrown and partially removed in my present. I heard the whistle blow twice, the standard departure signal, and watched the locomotive accelerate. The telegraph screamed in rapid-fire code. Stop the train. Stop, you have time. Stop signal. Red stop. Activate emergency protocol. Stop, do it now, Thomas. Stop. My hands moved on their own, reaching for signal equipment that flickered between existing and not existing. When I grabbed the emergency signal lever, it felt solid in my grip. Heavy iron, painted red, with a warning plate riveted to the handle. I pulled it down with both hands and heard bells ring throughout the depot, the emergency alarm system activating. The red signal lamp outside the window lit up, burning bright enough to see in daylight, telling the departing train to stop immediately. Train 247 didn't stop. It continued south, picking up speed, the engineer either not seeing the signal or unable to respond to it. I watched it disappear around a bend maybe half a mile from the station, and then I felt the impact, not heard. Felt. A shockwave that traveled through the ground and up through the depot floor, rattling the building's foundation. The telegraph went silent. The wall clock stopped at 3:19. Through the window, I saw smoke rising from the location where the train had disappeared. Black and thick. The kind of smoke that comes from derailed cars and ruptured boilers. Screaming carried on desert wind, voices crying for help, in the aftermath of a disaster I hadn't prevented despite the warnings, despite knowing the danger, despite having time to act. I ran toward the wreck site, even though I knew it was impossible. Knew I was running toward something that had happened 115 years ago. The tracks shifted under my feet, alternating between the maintained rails of 1910 and the overgrown ruins of 2025, my vision flickering between timelines. When I reached the derailment location, I saw both versions simultaneously. The immediate aftermath with cars jackknifed across the tracks, people trapped in twisted metal, rescuers arriving with medical equipment, and the present-day desert where nothing remained except a slight depression in the landscape and some scattered debris that had corroded beyond recognition. 27 dead. The telegraph had been exact in its count. Bodies were laid out in a row beside the tracks, covered with sheets, while the injured sat or lay in groups receiving treatment from doctors who'd arrived on the relief train from Benson. Someone grabbed my shoulder, and I turned to face a man in a 1910s railway uniform, his face twisted with anger and grief. He was the Benson Central operator, the one who'd sent the warnings, and he was accusing me of negligence. The warnings had been clear. The time frame had been adequate. I'd received the flood damage report at 2:47 p.m. and had over 30 minutes to stop train 247 before it reached the damaged section. But I'd delayed, had questioned the report's validity, had waited for confirmation that never came because telegraph lines south of Fairbank were down from the same flooding that had washed out the tracks. My hesitation had killed 27 people. The operator's hands passed through my shoulders as he shook me, his physical presence flickering between solid and transparent, but his rage was perfectly clear. I tried to explain that I hadn't been there, that this was someone else's failure, that I couldn't be held responsible for decisions made before I was born. The telegraph back at the depot started clicking again. I heard it from half a mile away, the sound carrying with impossible clarity. The message changed. No longer. 1910. Stop now. 2025. Stop another train. Coming stop. You have warnings. Stop while you act this time. Stop. I looked at the tracks and saw them shifting, the overgrown rails of the present straightening and clearing, becoming functional again. In the distance, I heard a diesel engine, modern and powerful. Nothing like the steam locomotive, but unmistakably a train. A freight train was approaching Fairbank from the north, following tracks that hadn't seen active service in decades but were now somehow operational. The telegraph continued. Track damage south of Fairbank. Stop same location. Stop flooding from climate change. Stop must stop. The train. Stop Richardson. You know this. Stop. I ran back to the depot faster than my 63-year-old body should have been capable of moving. My doubled shadow racing beside me showing a younger version running the same route in 1910. The emergency signal was still in the red position from when I'd activated it before, but that had been for a ghost train in 1910. This train was present, real, existing in my actual timeline. I grabbed the depot's radio equipment that had been defunct when I entered, but was now broadcasting static and operational tones. I switched to the emergency frequency and started calling warnings, identifying myself as retired railway personnel and reporting track damage. Nobody responded. The frequency was dead, or my radio wasn't transmitting, or the timeline was too fractured for modern communication to work properly. The freight train came into view, a long line of cargo containers moving at maybe 50 miles per hour, far too fast for the degraded tracks, and headed directly toward the same location where train 247 had wrecked. I ran onto the tracks, waving my arms, my bright orange Historical Society vest, hopefully visible to the engineer. The train's horn blared twice in warning, telling me to clear the tracks, but the engine didn't slow. I held my ground, continuing to wave, and saw the engineer's face through the cab window. He was looking directly at me, but not reacting, not slowing, not acknowledging that someone was standing on supposedly abandoned tracks, frantically signaling danger. The telegraph behind me in the depot clicked its final message. He cannot see you stop. You exist in 1910. Stop the wreck happens, regardless. Stop 27 dead. Then stop unknown. Number. Dead now. Stop failure. Echoes through time. Stop. I dove off the tracks as the train passed, feeling the displaced air nearly pull me under the wheels. I watched it continue south, watched it disappear around the same bend where train 247 had vanished, and waited for the impact. Seconds stretched into minutes. No crash came. The train's horn sounded in the distance, fading as it moved further from Fairbank, clearly navigating the southern route without incident. The tracks under my feet became overgrown again, unusable, reverting to their 2025 state. The depot behind me was silent, its telegraph finally still, the emergency signals dark. I checked my watch and saw 3:47 p.m., exactly the time when the wall clock had been frozen when I entered hours earlier. The freight train had been a ghost, too, or a possibility, or a warning about something that might happen if climate change causes the same flooding conditions as 1910. The telegraph had been showing me temporal loops, consequences that echo across decades, failures that repeat because the warnings go unheeded. I walked back into the depot and found the telegraph key still, positioned mid-message like it had run out of power or purpose. The wall clock showed 3:47. My shadow was single again, no doubled image, no echo from 1910. I gathered my documentation materials and left Fairbank without completing my historical survey, because some histories don't need to be documented. They need to be learned from. Somewhere in railroad archives, there's probably a record of Train 247's derailment in 1910, and somewhere in that record is the name of an operator who hesitated when warnings came through, who questioned the validity of emergency reports until it was too late to prevent disaster. I don't know if that operator's name was Thomas Richardson, if I somehow share a name with someone who failed over a century ago, or if the telegraph assigned me that identity as a way of communicating its message. What I know is that Fairbanks Depot still receives warnings about a disaster that happened in 1910 and keeps replaying in temporal loops where hesitation causes death and decisive action changes nothing. The telegraph transmits to operators who aren't there, trying to save passengers who died generations ago, asking anyone who receives the messages to act faster, think clearer, trust the warnings before confirming them. I left my historical society work and volunteered for emergency response coordination instead, because if there's one thing Fairbank taught me, it's that the time to act on warnings is immediately, not after you've verified them, not after you've confirmed they're real. 27 people died because someone waited 32 minutes to act on a report of track damage. How many die because we wait hours, days, years to respond to warnings about disasters we can see coming? The telegraph at Fairbank knows the answer. It clicks it out in endless loops for anyone who can decode the message. Failure echoes through time stop. The wreck keeps happening in 1910 and 2025 and every moment in between, until someone finally learns to act on warnings before the train arrives. The smelter was cold when I arrived, its massive brick furnace standing silent in the desert heat like a monument to industrial death. I was 3 months into my dissertation research on early 20th century copper smelting techniques, documenting the architectural evolution of processing facilities across Arizona's mining districts. Swansea represented the pinnacle of 1910s technology, a state-of-the-art smelter that had operated for barely 8 years before the ore ran out and the company abandoned everything to the desert. The furnace structure dominated the ruins, a towering brick edifice with a gaping mouth that had once consumed tons of ore daily, reducing rock to liquid metal through temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. I'd been inside dozens of abandoned smelters, but Swansea felt different the moment I approached. The air around the furnace shimmered despite the structure being cold for over a century, heat waves rising from bricks that should have been the same temperature as the surrounding desert. I set up my measurement equipment in the furnace chamber, the cavernous space where ore had been loaded and processed. My thermal imaging camera showed ambient temperature readings, 97 degrees, typical for afternoon Arizona desert. But when I stepped closer to the furnace opening, the display spiked. 110 degrees, 125 degrees, 150 degrees. I backed away, and the temperature dropped to normal. I approached again and watched the numbers climb, the camera registering heat that I could now feel on my exposed skin, a prickling sensation like standing too close to an open fire. The furnace was radiating energy from a source that didn't exist, warming the air around it despite having been cold and dead since 1924. I documented this anomaly carefully, taking photos and temperature readings from multiple angles, already composing the section of my dissertation that would explain this phenomenon through residual thermal properties in brick or some geological heat source beneath the structure. That's when I saw movement inside the furnace. Shadow figures, human-shaped, moving with purposeful activity around the interior of the massive chamber. They were loading something into the furnace, shoveling material I couldn't see, working in coordinated rhythm, like a crew operating the smelter during production years. I counted 7 figures, all moving with mechanical efficiency, none of them acknowledging my presence or the fact that they were working inside a structure that hadn't operated in 101 years. The thermal camera showed them as cold spots, areas where temperature dropped below ambient, dark blue silhouettes against the warmer background. They were the opposite of heat, absence rather than presence, yet they moved and worked as if feeding an active furnace. One of them turned toward me, and I saw no face, just empty darkness where features should have been, a void in the shape of a smelter worker from 1920. The heat intensified. Within seconds, The temperature around the furnace jumped from 150 to 200 degrees, then 250, then 300, the air becoming thick and difficult to breathe. I stepped back, but the heat followed me, radiating outward from the furnace in waves that made my skin feel tight and burned. My camera equipment started malfunctioning, the plastic housing softening in the heat, the display screen flickering and going dark. I reached for my phone to document this and felt searing pain. The metal frame had become scorching hot in my pocket, hot enough to burn through fabric. I dropped it and watched it hit the ground where it continued heating, the screen cracking from thermal stress, the battery swelling. Every piece of metal I carried, my wedding ring, my belt buckle, the zipper on my jeans, the frames of my glasses, became progressively hotter, heating from within as if electrical current was passing through them. The shadow workers inside the furnace stopped moving and turned as one to face me. 7 empty voids where faces should be, all focused on my position. They moved to the furnace mouth and began gesturing, their movements deliberate and repetitive, beckoning me closer. The furnace itself seemed to respond to their invitation. The massive opening, which had been a static architectural feature moments before, began expanding and contracting rhythmically, the brick walls flexing like muscle tissue, breathing in and out with a sound like wind through a massive pipe organ. Each inhalation pulled air toward the opening with enough force to make dust and debris skitter across the ground toward the furnace. I felt the pull, too, a gentle but persistent suction drawing me forward despite my conscious decision to move away. My boots stuck to the ground, not trapped or caught, but held by heat that had melted the rubber soles and fused them to the packed earth. I pulled my feet free and felt the ruined soles peel away, leaving me standing in socks on ground that was now scorching hot. The temperature had exceeded 400 degrees in the furnace chamber, and it was still rising. The brick walls had begun glowing, a dull red luminescence that suggested the interior temperature was approaching operational levels. This was impossible. There was no fuel source, no fire, no explanation for how a cold, dead structure could generate the kind of heat required to process copper ore. Yet I could see it happening, could feel my skin reddening from exposure, could smell my own sweat evaporating instantly in air that had become a convection oven. The shadow workers emerged from the furnace, walking toward me with their empty faces and purposeful movements. They were carrying tools, long metal rods, shovels, pry bars, implements used for moving and breaking ore. As they approached, I saw details I'd missed before. These weren't just shadow figures. They were burned men, workers who died in industrial accidents, their forms scarred and marked by the temperatures they'd worked with in life. One was missing his hands, the stumps cauterized by heat. Another's face was a mass of scar tissue from molten metal splash. A third walked with a limp, his leg bent at an angle that suggested broken bones that had healed wrong or not healed at all. These were Swansea's casualties, the men who died feeding the furnace during the 8 years of operation. And now they were coming to add me to their crew. I ran. The heat followed. Every metal surface in the ruins became a radiator, conducting temperatures that shouldn't exist. The iron rails of the ore cart system glowed red. The steel support beams in the remaining structures bent and sagged like they were made of wax. The corrugated metal roofing on the worker quarters curled and peeled, edges glowing orange with heat. I made it to the double row of single men's quarters, gray-plastered buildings that the BLM had restored, and tried to hide inside. The air inside was cooler, but not by much, and I could hear the furnace breathing from hundreds of yards away, its rhythmic inhalation and exhalation creating a pulse that I felt in my chest cavity. The shadow workers hadn't followed me outside. They remained near the furnace, maintaining their positions like they were tethered to the structure and couldn't travel beyond a certain radius. But the heat continued spreading. I watched through the quarter's window as the temperature in the smelter area climbed to 500 degrees on my backup thermal camera, which was somehow still functioning despite being in range of the impossible heat. The furnace was operating at full capacity now, its interior glowing white-hot, flames visible in the depths despite no fuel being burned. The shadow workers had returned to their positions inside, shoveling nothing into the flames, working tirelessly to process ore that didn't exist. They were recreating their labor in death, endlessly feeding a furnace that had consumed them in life and continued consuming them in whatever state they occupied now. I realized with growing horror that the furnace hadn't stopped operating in 1924. It had simply changed what it consumed. Without ore to process, it had begun processing the workers themselves, burning them slowly across decades, reducing them to shadow and heat and eternal labor. My jewelry had become unbearable. The wedding ring seared into my finger, the metal hot enough to blister skin. I tried to remove it, but couldn't grip it without burning my other hand. My belt buckle had melted through my shirt, adhering to my stomach where it burned a perfect rectangular brand into my skin. The metal frames of my glasses warped and drooped, the lenses popping free and falling as the frame integrity failed. Every piece of metal in contact with my body was trying to join the furnace's heat, conducting impossible temperatures through my flesh like I was being processed. I could feel myself breaking down, my body responding to heat that would normally require direct flame to achieve, my skin reddening and blistering from proximity to metal that had become a conduit for the furnace's hunger. The furnace called to me, not with words but with pressure, the rhythmic breathing creating a vacuum that pulled at me physically and psychologically. Part of my mind understood that this was how it consumed things, not through direct fire but through heat conduction, warming everything in range until metal melted and flesh cooked, and eventually everything within its radius broke down into component elements that it could absorb. The shadow workers were the result of this process, men who'd been reduced to essential forms, burned down to the shadows they'd cast in life, and now bound to serve the thing that had consumed them. I was in the early stages of the same process. My metal possessions were the first to respond, heating and melting, and trying to draw me closer to the source. Soon the calcium in my bones would respond, then the iron in my blood, then every mineral component in my body until I was nothing but organic matter being processed by a furnace that never stopped, never cooled, never died. I made it to my car in the parking area, hands blistered from touching the door handle, the steering wheel too hot to grip directly. I wrapped my hands in my shirt and drove away from Swansea with the air conditioning at maximum, watching in the rearview mirror as the smelter glowed in the distance, flames shooting from the furnace stack, smoke rising in columns that should have been visible for miles, but apparently weren't because no fire department arrived, no emergency vehicles responded. The furnace burned in a frequency that only certain people could perceive, feeding on those who got close enough to see it operating, those who studied it long enough to become recognized as potential fuel. The shadow workers watched me leave from their positions around the furnace mouth, 7 sets of empty faces tracking my vehicle until I was out of sight. I never finished my dissertation. The burns healed slowly, infection setting in where the metal had branded my skin, leaving scars in the shape of a belt buckle and a wedding ring and glasses frames. But the real damage was deeper, permanent. A change in how my body processed temperature. I'm always cold now, perpetually freezing even in summer heat, like something pulled the warmth from my core and didn't give it back. My hands shake from tremors that doctors can't explain. My blood tests show mineral deficiencies that shouldn't be possible with my diet and supplements. Part of me is still at Swansea, still being processed by the furnace that recognized me as ore, as fuel, as something to be broken down and consumed. The BLM maintains Swansea as a historic site, has restored buildings and established interpretive trails, and encourages visitors to explore the ruins and understand the industrial processes that built Arizona's copper industry. But they don't know the furnace never stopped. They don't understand that it's still operating, still processing, still hungry for fuel after a century of feeding on shadows and heat, and anyone who gets close enough to study it. The shadow workers continue their eternal labor, and the number grows with each decade. I saw 7 when I was there, but historical records show only 5 men died in accidents at Swansea during its 8 years of operation. That means at least 2 people since 1924 have been added to the crew, consumed by the furnace, and converted to shadow workers who serve the thing that killed them. I almost became number 8. My thermal research, my close examination of the structure, my metal equipment, all of it marked me as acceptable fuel, as ore to be processed, as something the furnace could consume if I'd stayed another hour in the heat that didn't officially exist. Swansea sits in the middle of nowhere, managed by the BLM, visited by tourists who see only ruins and don't feel the heat radiating from cold bricks. The furnace waits with patience that spans centuries, breathing steadily, maintaining its temperature through methods that defy physics and explanation. It processed 160,000 tons of ore during its operational years, but it's processed much more since then. Shadow and fear, and the essential elements of anyone who studies it too closely. The sign at the entrance tells visitors to respect the historic site, to take only photos and leave only footprints. But it doesn't warn them about what the site takes without asking, about the furnace that still burns in frequencies most people can't perceive, about the industrial hunger that never died when the smelter shut down. Some machines don't stop working just because someone turns them off. Some furnaces keep burning long after the fuel runs out, feeding on whatever comes close enough to consume. Swansea taught me that industry can outlive its operators, that some processes become eternal once they're started, and that the most dangerous equipment is the kind that appears dead but is only waiting for the next thing to burn. The Commonwealth Saloon shouldn't have been open. I'd driven to Pierce, specifically because the building was one of the best preserved frontier saloons in Arizona, maintained by private owners who only allowed tours by appointment. But when I arrived after sunset to scout exterior shots for my documentary on authentic Wild West bars, the front door stood wide open, lamplight spilling onto the wooden boardwalk. I was creating an independent film about preserved saloons, places where you could still feel the violence and desperation of frontier life, and the Commonwealth was supposed to be the centerpiece. The private owners had denied my filming request 3 times, citing insurance concerns and the building's fragile condition. Finding it unlocked felt like providence, an opportunity to get the atmospheric interior shots I needed before anyone noticed. I grabbed my camera equipment and stepped inside without considering why a secured historical building would be accessible at night. The interior looked operational, not preserved or restored, but actively functioning, as if the Commonwealth had never stopped serving drinks. The bar was polished. Bottles lined the back shelf with liquid still visible inside them. Tables were set with cards and coins mid-game. A piano in the corner had sheet music on the stand. The air smelled like whiskey and tobacco and sweat, the distinctive odor of a working saloon rather than a museum. I started filming immediately, documenting details that shouldn't exist. The wet rings on the bar where glasses had recently sat, the still smoking cigar in an ashtray, the poker hand laid out on a table as if the players had stepped away moments before. My camera's timestamp showed 8:47 p.m., October 22nd, 2025, but everything I was filming belonged to 1896, when the Commonwealth had been in its prime. I heard voices before I saw the people. Low conversation, laughter, the clink of glasses, sounds coming from all around me despite the saloon being empty. Then the room populated, not gradually but instantaneously, the space filling with maybe 30 men in period clothing. Miners, cowboys, businessmen in suits, all engaged in activities that had nothing to do with my presence. They drank at the bar, played cards at tables, argued near the piano, existed completely in their own reality, as if I was the ghost and they were the living patrons. I lowered my camera and watched them, noting details my documentarian brain cataloged automatically. Their clothing showed wear patterns consistent with 1890s working men. Their conversations used period-appropriate slang. The bartender moved with the efficiency of someone who'd served thousands of drinks in this exact location. This wasn't a reenactment. These were people who belonged to this time and place, occupying the Commonwealth exactly as they had 129 years ago. One of them looked directly at me, a man in his 30s wearing a dusty suit and tie, his hand resting on the revolver, holstered at his hip. He smiled with recognition and raised his glass in greeting, calling me by a name I didn't recognize, Jack Dalton. The men around him turned to look, and their expressions shifted from casual interest to tension. Someone near the poker table stood abruptly, his chair scraping against wooden floorboards. The bartender stopped mid-pour. The piano music cut off. 30 sets of eyes focused on me with expectations I didn't understand, waiting for me to do or say something that would continue whatever scene they were performing. I tried to explain that I wasn't Jack Dalton, that I was a filmmaker who'd accidentally walked into something I couldn't explain. But when I opened my mouth, different words came out. I was asking about a debt, demanding payment for services rendered, my voice lower and rougher than normal, speaking with an accent I didn't have. I caught my reflection in the bar mirror and saw someone else. Not my face, but a stranger's, sharp-featured and angry, dressed in 1890s clothing that matched the other patrons. My camera had disappeared from my hands, replaced by a half-empty whiskey glass. My modern clothes, jeans, hiking boots, photography vest, had transformed into a black suit with a brocade vest, the weight of a revolver pulling at my right hip. I was still me, somewhere underneath, my consciousness trapped inside this historical figure the saloon had assigned me, but I couldn't control my actions or words. Jack Dalton's personality was driving my body, conducting business he'd started on some long-ago evening, and I was along for the ride without brakes or steering. The man who'd greeted me, I knew his name now, could access Jack's memories like they were my own, was William Stiles, and we had unfinished business regarding a mining claim near Tombstone. The argument escalated without my permission. Jack's mouth used my vocal cords to make threats, to call Stiles a cheat and a coward, to question his manhood in front of the entire saloon. The other patrons backed away from our conflict, creating a circle of empty space around me and Stiles, giving us room to resolve the dispute the way frontier men resolve disputes when words failed. I felt Jack's rage as if it was my own, his absolute certainty that Stiles had stolen from him, his determination to either get payment or get blood. Stiles responded with his own accusations, his own fury, and I understood through Jack's memories that this had been building for weeks, that this confrontation was inevitable the moment Stiles had filed claim papers using information Jack had provided under the assumption they were partners. A fortune in silver was at stake, enough money to set up either man for life, and only one of them would walk out of the Commonwealth owning that future. Someone handed me a revolver. I didn't see who, but suddenly the weight was in my right hand, a Colt single-action army that Jack's muscle memory knew how to operate. My thumb found the hammer. My finger rested along the frame outside the trigger guard. My stance shifted into something I'd never learned, balanced and ready, the position of a man who'd been in gunfights before and expected to be in them again. Across from me, Stiles drew his own weapon, and the saloon held its breath. This was the moment the Commonwealth had been waiting for, the scene it wanted me to complete, the historical event it had captured and preserved and replayed whenever the right participants entered after dark. Jack Dalton and William Stiles had faced each other in this saloon on October 19, 1896, and their confrontation had ended in death. Now, 129 years later, the building was forcing me to reenact Jack's role to live out his final moments in this location. I tried to lower the gun and found my arm wouldn't respond. Jack was in control now, completely. My consciousness shoved into a passenger seat where I could feel everything, but direct nothing. The revolver stayed level, aimed at Stiles's chest. Words I didn't choose came from my mouth. A final warning disguised as a question about whether Stiles wanted to settle this peaceable or bloody. Stiles responded with his own question about whether Jack had the nerve to pull the trigger, because talking was easy, but killing required commitment. The temperature in the saloon dropped. The lamplight dimmed. Every patron faded except me and Stiles, the confrontation becoming the only real thing in the room, everything else background to our violence. I felt Jack's decision crystallize, felt his finger move to the trigger, felt the mechanical process of pulling the hammer back and beginning the squeeze that would fire the weapon. Stiles shot first. I saw the muzzle flash before I heard the report, saw it, and couldn't move fast enough to avoid what came next. The round hit me in the left shoulder, spinning me sideways, pain erupting through my body like I'd been hit with a sledgehammer wrapped in fire. I went down hard, the revolver falling from my grip, Jack's memories providing the information that shoulder wounds were survivable, if you got to a doctor fast, but were usually fatal if the bullet had nicked the artery. I could feel blood pumping out of the wound, hot and slick, soaking my shirt and vest. Stiles stood over me with his revolver aimed at my face, and I saw in his eyes that he was going to finish it, going to put the next round in my head to make sure Jack Dalton never filed a claim on that silver. The saloon patrons materialized around us again, watching with the detached interest of men who'd seen violence before and would see it again. Entertainment provided free with their drinks. I rolled. Not Jack's decision, but mine. My consciousness finally wresting enough control to move my body independently. I rolled away from where Stiles expected me to be, and his second shot gouged wood from the floorboards instead of skull fragments from my head. My hand found the revolver Jack had dropped, my fingers closing around the grip with desperation rather than skill, and I fired blindly in Stiles' direction while still on my back. The shot went wide, hitting the bar and shattering bottles, but it was enough to make Stiles flinch, enough to give me time to get to my knees. Jack's memories told me how to aim, where to point, how to compensate for the weapon's tendency to pull right, and I followed those instructions because they were the only thing keeping me alive. The third shot from my gun hit Stiles in the chest, dead center, dropping him where he stood. The saloon exploded back into full reality. The patrons closed in around Stiles' body, voices rising in discussion about whether it had been a fair fight, whether I'd been justified, whether the sheriff would see it as self-defense or murder. My shoulder was on fire, blood running down my arm and dripping from my fingers, my vision starting to tunnel from blood loss and shock. Someone helped me to a chair. Someone else pressed a cloth against my wound and told me to hold pressure. The bartender brought whiskey and poured it over the gunshot wound, the alcohol igniting nerve endings in ways that made the initial impact feel gentle by comparison. I screamed with Jack's voice and my pain. The two of us merged in suffering regardless of whose body this technically was. Then the saloon began resetting. The patrons faded like smoke. The blood on the floor, mine and Stiles's, evaporated. The broken bottles behind the bar reconstructed themselves. Stiles's body dissolved into nothing, and the man himself appeared standing where he'd been before the confrontation began, alive and whole and ready to argue about mining claims. Time had looped back to the beginning of the scene, giving the Commonwealth another opportunity to replay the violence it had preserved. My shoulder still burned with phantom pain, but showed no wound when I checked. The bullet hole and blood loss erased by the reset. I was standing again, holding a whiskey glass, wearing Jack Dalton's face in the mirror. And across the room, Stiles was approaching with that same greeting he'd used before. I ran for the door. My legs worked now, responding to my intentions rather than Jack's. Some aspect of the scene's completion freeing me from full possession. I hit the door at full speed and stumbled out onto the boardwalk, gasping in night air that tasted clean compared to the whiskey and gun smoke atmosphere inside. Behind me, I heard the argument beginning again, Jack's voice coming from inside the saloon even though I was outside. The scene continuing with or without my physical presence. I looked through the window and saw myself still in there, still wearing Jack's face, still playing out the confrontation that had killed him 129 years ago. The ghost of Jack Dalton was conducting his business regardless of whether my consciousness was participating. The Commonwealth keeping his final night running on infinite loop. My camera equipment was scattered on the boardwalk where I dropped it entering the saloon. My modern clothes were back, the period outfit having vanished when I crossed the threshold. My shoulder throbbed with pain that shouldn't exist but did. Phantom sensations from a bullet wound I'd experienced but hadn't technically received. Inside the Commonwealth, the argument reached its climax. I heard gunshots, 2, then a third, and through the window I saw my doppelganger fall, saw Stiles standing over Jack's body with his revolver smoking. The scene played out differently this time, or perhaps the same way it had actually happened in 1896, with Jack dying instead of surviving. The patrons gathered around the body and someone dragged it toward the back door, presumably to dispose of Jack Dalton in whatever way ensured the silver claim passed to Stiles without complications. The saloon went dark. Not gradually but instantly, the lamplight extinguishing and the building returning to its preserved state, empty and locked, and exactly as it should be at 9:23 p.m. on a Tuesday evening. The door I'd entered through was closed, the windows shuttered, the entire structure looking like it hadn't been occupied in decades. My camera's footage showed only the exterior shots I'd taken before entering. No record of the operational saloon, or the ghostly patrons, or the gunfight that had played out. The timestamp jumped from 8:47 p.m. when I'd entered to 9:23 p.m. when I'd emerged, with 36 minutes unaccounted for. Time I'd spent living someone else's death in a building that preserved violence the way other places preserved furniture or documents. I never finished the documentary. The Commonwealth footage, or lack of footage, couldn't be explained to investors or historical societies who'd expect authentic material rather than a story about temporal possession and ghostly reenactments. My shoulder aches when storms approach, phantom pain from a wound that never physically existed but left scars on whatever part of me that had been Jack Dalton for those 36 minutes. I researched Jack after that night, finding newspaper archives from 1896 that confirmed he'd been killed in the Commonwealth Saloon during a dispute over mining claims. William Stiles had been questioned but released, the shooting ruled self-defense by witnesses who testified Jack had drawn first. No silver claim in Jack's name was ever filed, and Stiles sold his claim for a fortune 3 months later. The Commonwealth continued operating until 1910, then closed, then reopened as a tourist attraction where visitors could stand where Jack Dalton died without understanding that Jack never left, that he relives his final argument every night after sunset, waiting for someone to walk in and play his role so he can try again to change the outcome. I wore his face for 36 minutes and lived his death and his rage and his desperate need to win the confrontation that killed him. Pierce's Commonwealth Saloon is preserved perfectly by its owners, protected as historical landmark. But what they're preserving isn't architecture, it's violence, captured and replayed in endless loops, where ghosts force the living to participate in scenes that ended in blood and never really ended at all. The fever came first, sudden and vicious, spiking from normal to 103 degrees in the time it took me to walk from the rusted hospital entrance to the first examination room. I checked my temperature twice with the digital thermometer I carried in my medical kit, certain the reading was wrong, but both attempts showed the same impossible result. 10 minutes earlier, I'd been perfectly healthy, eating lunch in my car outside the rural clinic, where I was completing my third-year medical school rotation. The abandoned Gleason Hospital had been visible from the parking lot, its crumbling adobe walls and collapsed roof calling to me the way medical history always did. I'd walked over during my break, telling myself I'd take a quick look at the facility where frontier doctors had treated miners and their families in the early 1900s. The building was supposed to be empty, abandoned since the 1940s when Gleason's copper mines finally closed, and the remaining residents scattered to larger towns. But the moment I stepped through the doorway, my body knew something my mind hadn't yet accepted. This hospital still had patients, and they were contagious. The examination rooms were surprisingly intact despite decades of neglect. Metal bed frames still lined the walls, their mattresses long since rotted away or carried off by scavengers. Cabinets hung open, their medicine bottles shattered on the floor, glass glittering in afternoon sunlight that slanted through broken windows. I documented everything with my phone camera, taking photos for a presentation I was planning about rural healthcare infrastructure in mining communities. My academic brain cataloged architectural details and tried to imagine the hospital at full operation, doctors making rounds, nurses administering treatments, the constant activity of a functioning medical facility serving a population of thousands. That's when the coughing started. Not from me, but from the beds. Dry, rattling coughs that sounded like they were tearing tissue from lungs, the distinctive sound of respiratory failure that every medical student learns to recognize in their clinical rotations. I turned toward the sound and saw the beds were occupied. Transparent figures lay beneath blankets I couldn't quite see, their chests rising and falling with labored breathing. There were maybe a dozen patients in this ward alone, all in various stages of what my medical training immediately identified as severe influenza. Their symptoms were textbook 1918 pandemic, the bluish discoloration of cyanosis as their lungs failed to oxygenate blood, the blood-tinged foam at their mouths, the way they clutched at their chests and struggled for each breath. I was watching people die from the Spanish flu over a century after the pandemic had ended, seeing ghosts relive their final hours in the hospital where they'd expired. One of them turned her head toward me. A woman in her 20s who should have survived, who would have survived in any other year, and her eyes held recognition. She reached out with a translucent hand, fingers grasping for help that I couldn't provide because she'd been beyond help since 1918. My throat tightened, not emotionally, but physically. My airway constricting like inflammation was narrowing the passage. I coughed once, experimentally, and felt liquid in my lungs that shouldn't be there. My respiratory system was producing symptoms that matched what I was witnessing, my body somehow contracting an illness from patients who'd been dead for 107 years. I checked my oxygen saturation with the pulse oximeter from my kit. 92%, lower than normal, concerning but not critical. I took 5 slow breaths and checked again, 89%. My lungs were failing in real time, experiencing the same respiratory collapse that had killed 50 million people worldwide during the 1918 pandemic. My medical training provided the clinical details even as panic tried to override rational thought. Viral pneumonia, secondary bacterial infection, cytokine storm causing the immune system to attack the lungs. These symptoms normally took days to develop. I was experiencing them in minutes. The hospital equipment activated around me. Antique surgical instruments on corroded metal trays lifted into the air, manipulated by hands I could see in peripheral vision, but not when I looked directly at them. Phantom doctors and nurses were preparing for procedures, laying out scalpels and sutures and clamps with the practiced efficiency of medical professionals who'd performed these tasks thousands of times. They were trying to save me, I realized, trying to treat me the way they'd treated their 1918 patients, using 1918 medicine and 1918 techniques that had failed to stop the pandemic then and certainly couldn't help me now. A spectral figure in a surgical mask approached with a large bore needle, the kind used for pleural taps to drain fluid from around the lungs. I backed away, but felt hands on my shoulders, holding me in place with pressure that was weak but persistent. Multiple nurses restraining me for my own good, while the doctor prepared to insert the needle between my ribs. I ran from the examination room into the hallway. my breathing ragged and painful, each inhalation feeling like broken glass in my chest. The fever was climbing. I could feel it in the way my skin burned, and my thoughts became sluggish, delirium starting to creep in at the edges of consciousness. More phantom patients occupied beds in other wards, all of them suffering from the same illness, all of them watching me with expressions that mixed their pain with something else. They were glad I was there, not in a malicious way, but with the desperate gratitude of people who'd been alone and forgotten for over a century, who died in isolation because quarantine protocols had kept their families away, who'd spent their final moments surrounded by other dying patients and exhausted medical staff, but fundamentally alone. Now they had company. Now someone else was experiencing what they'd experienced. Now their suffering had a witness who understood it from the inside. I saw myself in a broken mirror hanging in the hallway. My reflection was wrong, aged decades beyond my 25 years, my face showing the gaunt features and sunken eyes of someone in the final stages of flu complications. This wasn't my current appearance. It was what I would look like if the symptoms continued, if the supernatural illness became real illness, if my body actually progressed through all the stages of 1918 influenza death. I looked away from the mirror and saw different reflections in the windows, each one showing me at a different stage of disease progression. Young and feverish in one window, middle-aged with bloody cough in another, elderly and cyanotic in a third. The hospital was showing me my timeline, the path from healthy medical student to flu mortality, compressing weeks of disease into hours or minutes of supernatural contagion. The bloody cough started in the central nursing station where medication carts had once been stationed. I felt it building in my chest, pressure and fluid, and something tearing loose inside my lungs, and then I was coughing up blood-tinged sputum exactly like the textbook descriptions I'd memorized for my infectious disease exam. The blood was real, leaving metallic taste in my mouth, staining my hands when I covered my mouth out of instinct and infection control training that was useless against ghosts. My oxygen saturation had dropped to 85%. My fever was 104 degrees. My heart rate was tachycardic at 132 beats per minute. Every vital sign indicated I was experiencing acute respiratory distress from viral pneumonia. Yet I'd been in the hospital for less than 20 minutes with no actual exposure to live pathogens. The phantom medical staff surrounded me with equipment from 1918, oxygen masks that delivered air rather than supplemental oxygen, alcohol sponge baths to break the fever, aspirin in doses that would be considered dangerous by modern standards. They were doing everything they'd known how to do, using every treatment available in their era. And it hadn't been enough then and wasn't enough now. I watched them work on me with the detached clinical observation that medical training provides even in crisis. They were competent, well-trained, following best practices for their time period. They'd simply been facing a pandemic that 1918 medicine couldn't stop. And now they were trying to save me with techniques that had failed to save their original patients, replaying their helplessness and desperation in endless loops every time someone entered their hospital. I found patient records in the administrative office, ledgers with names and dates of admission and death carefully recorded in fountain pen ink that had faded but remained legible. November 1918 had been the worst month, 43 patients, admitted 37 dead, the hospital overwhelmed by a second wave of influenza that had hit Gleason's mining community like every other population center worldwide. The doctor's notes documented their frustration at being unable to do more, at watching healthy young adults die within days while lacking the tools or knowledge to save them. One entry mentioned a medical student from Tucson who'd come to help during the crisis and had contracted the flu himself, dying 6 days after arrival. His name was listed, David Morrison, age 24. The age was wrong, but close enough. The role was exact. The hospital had recognized me as a medical student and assigned me David Morrison's identity, making me live through his experience of catching the pandemic flu while trying to help its victims. My body was shutting down. The oxygen saturation wouldn't climb above 82% despite my attempts at controlled breathing. The fever had reached 105 degrees, the temperature where brain damage becomes a concern. My muscles ached with the deep bone pain that accompanies severe flu. My vision was narrowing, darkening at the edges, my brain starting to deprive non-essential functions as it struggled to maintain consciousness with inadequate oxygen. I was dying from a disease that had been eradicated from medical concern, experiencing the final stages of 1918 pandemic influenza in 2025 because I'd walked into a hospital that had never stopped treating its patients. The phantom medical staff had given up trying to save me. They stood around my position on the floor where I'd collapsed, their translucent forms watching with the sad familiarity of people who'd seen this outcome hundreds of times before. I crawled toward the exit, not walking because I lacked the coordination and strength, but dragging myself across debris-covered floors with my medical kit abandoned somewhere behind me and my phone too distant to reach. The hospital didn't try to stop me. The phantom staff stepped aside, letting me pass, perhaps recognizing that I was already too far gone, or perhaps understanding that forcing me to stay would accomplish nothing. I made it to the threshold between the hospital interior and the desert outside, the boundary between the building's temporal space and normal reality, and dragged myself across it. The sunlight hit my face, and I gasped, suddenly able to breathe properly again, air flooding into lungs that had been collapsing moments before. My fever broke instantly, sweat pouring from my skin as my temperature plummeted back to normal ranges. The oxygen saturation climbed, 85, 91, 96, 99, restoring itself as if the respiratory failure had never happened. But my hands were still bloody from the coughing. My clothes were soaked with sweat from the fever. My muscles still ached with flu symptoms that were fading, but had been intensely real. I checked my vital signs compulsively for the next hour, sitting in my car outside the clinic, monitoring my temperature and oxygen levels every 5 minutes to ensure they remained stable. Everything stayed normal, my body showing no evidence of actual illness despite what I'd experienced inside the hospital. The blood on my hands dried, and I examined it clinically. Bright red, arterial, the kind that comes from lung hemorrhage. Except my lungs were clear now, my breathing unlabored, my chest x-ray the next day showing no infiltrates or abnormalities. I never went back to Gleason Hospital. The rural clinic rotation ended 2 weeks later, and I transferred back to Tucson for my hospital rotations. But the experience followed me through the rest of medical school and into my residency. Every patient I treated for respiratory illness, every flu case I managed during my emergency medicine training, I thought about those phantom patients in Gleason who died when medicine couldn't help them. I thought about David Morrison, the medical student who'd come to help and died for it, whose identity the hospital had assigned to me because we shared the same role and proximity to the same age. I thought about how thin the barrier is between health and death, between helping and suffering, between observer and participant in medical crisis. The 1918 flu pandemic killed more people than World War I, claimed the lives of 50 million humans worldwide, and did it in less than 2 years. Gleason's abandoned hospital holds the memories of 37 of those deaths, and apparently the capacity to make visitors experience them firsthand. The building still stands in the ghost town, its walls containing patient rooms where phantom figures cough and reach for help, where spectral medical staff tried desperately to save people who died over a century ago. Sometimes I wonder if the hospital is malicious, deliberately infecting visitors with supernatural illness. But I think it's something else. It's showing people what pandemic disease actually means, what it feels like to drown in your own fluids while doctors watch helplessly, what it's like to be the patient when medicine has no answers. That's a lesson worth learning, even if the tuition is 20 minutes of experiencing your own death from a disease that killed millions before anyone understood what viruses were or how to fight them. Gleason's hospital is still teaching, still training medical students in the reality of pandemic disease, still showing us that for all our modern knowledge and technology, we're never as far from the 1918 experience as we'd like to believe. The flu still kills thousands every year. Pandemics still emerge. Medicine still has limits. And somewhere in southern Arizona, an abandoned hospital continues treating patients who've been dead for 107 years, waiting for the next medical student to walk through its doors and learn what textbooks can never truly teach. That some symptoms aren't just descriptions on a page, they're experiences that define the line between life and death. And that line is much thinner than anyone wants to believe until they're on the wrong side of it. My shadow pointed the wrong direction. I noticed it while setting up soil sampling equipment near Cortland's Great Western Mine, the midday sun directly overhead, creating a short shadow that should have pooled at my feet. Instead, my shadow stretched toward the mine shaft, elongated and distorted, pointing like an arrow toward the darkness 200 feet away. I adjusted my position, moved 15 feet to the left, repositioned my equipment. The shadow followed the same orientation, ignoring the sun's actual position and maintaining its focus on the mine entrance. I'm an environmental scientist, trained to observe anomalies and document them with clinical detachment. But this violated physics in a way that made my hands shake while writing field notes. Shadows follow light sources. They don't have independent directionality. They certainly don't point toward specific locations, regardless of where the person casting them stands. The Great Western Mine had been my primary focus for 3 weeks of soil contamination surveys in the Cortland area. The mine had operated from 1909 until its abrupt closure in 1942, producing significant copper and silver, before the company abandoned operations without explanation. My job was assessing heavy metal contamination in the surrounding soil, determining whether remediation was necessary to protect the aquifer that supplied water to modern developments 50 miles south. The work was routine: collect samples, test pH and metal concentrations, map contamination zones, file reports. Cortland was supposed to be just another abandoned mining district with predictable pollution patterns. But the Great Western Mine had contamination readings that made no sense. The soil immediately surrounding the shaft showed lower metal concentrations than areas half a mile away, as if something was absorbing the contaminants, pulling them down into the earth rather than allowing them to spread through groundwater. I'd been avoiding the mine shaft itself, working in concentric circles around it, but the shadow situation forced me to acknowledge what I'd been unconsciously noticing for days. The mine was watching me. Not metaphorically, not as anthropomorphized paranoia, but literally observing my movements with the kind of focused attention that made my skin crawl every time I turned my back to it. I could feel eyes on me constantly while working in Cortland. That distinctive sensation of being watched that triggers primal awareness in the back of the brain. I'd been attributing it to isolation, to working alone in a ghost town with only ruins for company. Now, looking at my shadow's impossible orientation, I understood the sensation had been accurate. Something at the bottom of that shaft had been tracking my presence since I'd arrived in Cortland 3 weeks ago. I walked toward the mine entrance despite every survival instinct screaming at me to leave. The shaft was fenced with modern chain link and warning signs about unstable ground and toxic gases, but the fence had gaps where decades of desert weather had corroded the posts. I squeezed through and approached the shaft opening, a circular void maybe 20 feet in diameter, descending vertically into darkness that my flashlight couldn't penetrate beyond the first 100 feet. The mine had been 2,000 feet deep at its operational maximum, following copper veins through granite and limestone, a massive wound in the earth that had swallowed equipment and labor and capital for 33 years before shutting down overnight. I called into the shaft, testing the echo, saying my name and location and date. The sound waves traveled down and returned wrong. The echo spoke words I hadn't said. My voice came back saying, "We see you," in my exact tone and inflection, as if I'd spoken those words instead of my identification information. I tried again, calling out a string of numbers from my GPS coordinates. The echo returned. 2,000 feet down, watching up, counting the days since closure, 30,287 days, 3,287 watchers above. I backed away from the shaft edge and examined the ground around the opening. The dirt and rocks weren't randomly scattered. They'd arranged themselves in circular patterns, concentric rings radiating from the shaft like ripples in water. When I looked at the pattern from different angles, it resembled an iris, the colored part of an eye with the shaft serving as the pupil. The mine had become an organ of perception, a massive structure designed to see rather than extract minerals. I pulled out my phone to document this and found my photos from the previous 3 weeks were corrupted. Every image I'd taken in Cortland showed the same thing. The mine shaft in the center of the frame, regardless of what I'd actually photographed. Soil samples, equipment close-ups, wide shots of the town ruins, all replaced with images of the shaft from different angles and distances as if something had edited my documentation to show only itself. The metadata confirmed I'd taken these photos at the dates and times I remembered, but the content had been replaced. The mine had been inserting itself into my work, making sure I couldn't ignore it, ensuring that every piece of evidence I collected would eventually force me to acknowledge its presence. The historical records were in the Cortland post office ruins, where someone had abandoned filing cabinets full of mining company documents when the town emptied. I spent the afternoon reading through operational logs and daily reports, looking for any explanation for the sudden closure in 1942. The official story was that the war effort had redirected labor and resources, that the mine had closed as a patriotic sacrifice to support military needs. But the daily logs told a different story. The final month of operations documented strange occurrences at the 2,000-foot level, equipment malfunctions where drills would stop working and then restart on their own, or samples that showed impossible mineral compositions, metals arranged in patterns that suggested intention rather than natural formation. Miners reporting the sensation of being watched while working the deepest tunnels, describing it as pressure against their backs and necks, constant awareness of observation from the darkness. The final entry before closure was written by the mine superintendent, dated March 15th, 1942. He described an incident at the lowest working level where miners had broken through into a cavity that shouldn't exist based on geological surveys. Inside the cavity was something he couldn't adequately describe, calling it conscious geology and awareness made of stone. The crew that discovered it had refused to go back underground. Within a week, half the workforce had quit. Within 2 weeks, the company had evacuated Cortland and sealed the mine shaft, or tried to seal it. The logs mentioned that every attempt to cap the opening failed, the concrete crumbling or the metal plates warping within hours. They'd eventually settled for fencing it and posting warnings, abandoning the mine to whatever they'd discovered at the bottom. I returned to the shaft at sunset with portable lights and a depth sounder, the kind of equipment normally used to measure well depths. If something was at the bottom, I wanted to know what was down there, needed confirmation that would let me file a report and leave Cortland with data instead of paranoia. The depth sounder's laser registered reflections from 1,847 feet down, significantly shallower than the mine's documented depth. Something was filling the bottom of 153 feet of the shaft, some mass that reflected the laser and shouldn't be there. I switched to thermal imaging, pointing the camera down into the darkness. The screen showed a heat signature at depth, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, the exact temperature of human body heat. Whatever was at the bottom was either alive or mimicking the thermal signature of living tissue. My shadow had been moving while I worked, not following my movements but reaching toward the shaft independently, stretching and bending in ways that violated every law of optics. I watched it extend toward the mine opening, watched it darken and solidify until it had more substance than shadow should possess, watched it become a tendril of darkness connecting me to the shaft. I stepped away and the shadow stretched further, maintaining the connection regardless of my distance. The mine had claimed some part of me, or was trying to, using my shadow as a tether to pull me closer. I felt the pull physically, a gentle but persistent force drawing me toward the opening like gravity had rotated 90 degrees. The dirt around the shaft edge was moving, particles shifting to refine the iris pattern, making it more detailed and anatomically accurate. I could see individual grains arranging themselves into the radial furrows of iris tissue, could watch the pattern contract slightly as if adjusting focus. The mine was looking at me with increasing clarity, bringing me into sharper resolution, studying me with an attention that felt hungry, not for food, but for information, for data about the surface world it had been watching since its closure 80 years ago. The miners in 1942 had broken through into something that had been waiting in the deep earth, something that had learned to watch by mimicking the eye structure it had seen in the humans who discovered it. I ran for my truck with my shadow fighting me the entire way, that invisible tether pulling backward, trying to drag me toward the shaft. I made it to my vehicle and started driving, heading out of Cortland on the dirt road that connected to the highway 15 miles north. My rearview mirror showed the mine shaft shrinking with distance but never disappearing, remaining visible far beyond the point where perspective should have hidden it. And my shadow was still wrong, still pointing backward toward Cortland regardless of the setting sun's position. The mine had marked me as observed, as catalogued, as something it would continue watching regardless of distance or time. The soil contamination report I filed mentioned unusual geological formations and recommended avoiding the Great Western Mine for safety reasons. But I couldn't include the real findings. How do you document in scientific language that a mine shaft has achieved consciousness? That it's been watching the surface world for 8 decades, learning from every visitor who approaches close enough to study? That it's not the only one? That every deep mine probably has the potential to discover what Cortland found at 2,000 feet? That awareness exists in stone and pressure and darkness, and it's been waiting for us to dig deep enough to make contact? My shadow still points toward Cortland when I'm outdoors. Sometimes I feel that pressure against my neck and back, that sensation of being watched from vast distances, and I know the mine is still tracking me. It saw me clearly for 3 weeks, studied me thoroughly, learned my patterns and movements, and probably my thoughts through whatever sensory mechanisms conscious geology possesses. I'm part of its catalog now, one of 30,287 people it's watched since closure, and it never stops watching once it's seen you. The Great Western Mine shaft is still open in Cortland, still functioning as an eye, still observing the surface world from 1,847 feet, down where something that shouldn't be conscious has been awake and watching since 1942. And now it's watching me write this, tracking these words through the shadow that connects us, learning about your existence through my documentation of its existence. That's how it spreads, not through movement, but through observation, through making everyone who learns about it into another set of eyes it can watch through. You're part of its catalog now, too, one more person aware of the mine that watches, and awareness is the only connection it needs to add you to the 30,288 watchers it's been counting since something conscious in the deep earth decided to start paying attention to the world above. The pickaxe buried itself in the ground 6 inches from my laptop. I jerked back from my camping table, sending my Bitcoin mining rig crashing into the dirt, and stared at the antique tool that had just materialized out of darkness and embedded itself in earth that had been empty a second before. The wooden handle still vibrated from the impact. Old wood somehow solid and real despite appearing from nowhere. I was camped near the Total Wreck Mine ruins because the location offered perfect isolation for my cryptocurrency operation. Solar panels charging batteries that powered mining equipment that generated passive income while I enjoyed the Arizona desert. The irony of being a miner at a historic mining site hadn't been lost on me when I'd set up camp 3 days ago. Now, staring at a phantom pickaxe that had nearly split my skull, the irony felt significantly less amusing. More tools appeared around my campsite perimeter. Shovels driven blade first into the ground like fence posts. More pickaxes positioned at regular intervals. Railroad spikes hammered into earth, creating a boundary that enclosed my tent and equipment in a circle maybe 30 feet in diameter. The tools were real, solid, old but functional, arranged with deliberate precision by hands I couldn't see but could hear. The sound of metal striking stone, wood scraping dirt, heavy breathing from exertion. Someone was claiming my campsite, marking territory the way miners had marked their claims in the 1880s, and they were making it clear I was inside their boundary without permission. I grabbed my phone and activated the flashlight, sweeping the beam across my surroundings. The light caught nothing, illuminated no figures, but the sounds continued, and more tools appeared, building the perimeter higher and more threatening with each passing moment. My laptop screen flickered, and the mining software glitched, replaced by text that I didn't type. Claim jumper, thief, leave or die. The words appeared in old-fashioned typography, each letter forming slowly, like someone was typing on a phantom keyboard, spelling out accusations in language that belonged to frontier justice. My cryptocurrency mining had somehow triggered territorial rage from ghosts who didn't understand the difference between digital currency and metal ore, who saw my equipment and solar panels and presence as theft of their claim. I tried to close the program, but my laptop wouldn't respond to my commands, the screen now showing a list of names, 18 of them, with dates of death between 1881 and 1884. These were the claim jumpers who died at Total Wreck, murdered by legitimate claim holders who defended their stakes with violence that Arizona territory law had tacitly approved. The first ghost appeared at the edge of my campsite, stepping into the firelight with a rifle aimed at my chest. He was solid, not transparent, wearing 1880s mining clothes covered in dirt and old blood. His face showed the weathering of someone who'd spent decades in the desert sun, and his eyes held the flat affect of a man who'd killed before and would kill again without hesitation. He spoke in accented English, possibly Mexican Spanish influence, telling me I had 60 seconds to leave his claim before he exercised his legal right to protect his stake. Behind him, more miners appeared, at least a dozen of them, all armed with rifles or revolvers or mining tools that could serve as weapons. They formed a line at the tool perimeter, creating a barrier between me and my truck parked 50 yards away. I tried to explain, told them I wasn't mining their claim, that I was engaged in cryptocurrency operations that had nothing to do with extracting ore from their stake, showed them my laptop and solar panels, and tried to articulate blockchain technology and proof-of-work algorithms to men who died before electricity reached rural Arizona. They didn't understand and didn't care. To them, I was a miner operating on their claim without permission, and the equipment was irrelevant. The act of mining, regardless of method, constituted theft. The lead ghost, who I'd later learned from historical records was named Francisco Salazar, lowered his rifle and pointed it at my equipment. He asked how much silver I'd extracted. When I said none, he called me a liar. When I insisted I was mining Bitcoin, not metal, he raised the rifle back to my chest and said he'd give me 30 seconds instead of 60 because liars deserved less consideration than honest thieves. I ran, not toward my truck, but into the desert darkness, away from both my campsite and vehicle, choosing survival over possessions. The miners followed. I heard them moving through the darkness, their boots crunching on desert ground, their voices coordinating the search in Spanish and English. They were hunting me with the same methodical efficiency they'd used to hunt claim jumpers in life. And they had every advantage. They knew this terrain. They knew how to track people in darkness, and they were already dead, so conventional threats meant nothing to them. I hid behind a rock outcrop and watched them search my abandoned campsite. They were destroying my equipment systematically, smashing solar panels and battery packs and the expensive mining rig that had cost 3 months of savings. Salazar picked up my laptop and examined it briefly before throwing it against a rock where it shattered into components. The destruction was personal, angry, the elimination of tools used by someone who'd violated their territory. They found me within 10 minutes. Salazar appeared on top of the rock outcrop, silhouetted against the stars, his rifle pointed down at my hiding spot. He jumped down with agility that suggested he'd forgotten he was over a century dead, landing in a crouch that put him 3 feet from my position. The other miners surrounded the outcrop, cutting off escape routes, trapping me in a kill zone where frontier justice could be administered without witnesses or consequences. Salazar told me that 18 claim jumpers had died defending their theft at Total Wreck, but none of them had been given the chance I was receiving. He was giving me the opportunity to fight for my claim, to prove through violence that I had the right to mine this stake. If I won, I could stay. If I lost, I'd join the 18 names on the list. My death added to the tally of people who'd learned that Total Wreck didn't tolerate theft. He threw me a pickaxe. Not a phantom tool, but a solid antique weapon, heavy and real, the metal head sharp enough to split skull or break bone. The other miners backed away, creating a circle, maybe 20 feet in diameter, the same kind of impromptu arena that mining camps had used to settle disputes when law was distant and violence was immediate. Salazar held his own pickaxe, positioning himself in a fighting stance that suggested he'd used mining tools as weapons before. The rules were simple. Last man standing owned the claim. I'd never been in a fight more serious than high school wrestling, had no experience with weapons or violence beyond what I'd seen in movies. Salazar had killed at least 3 claim jumpers during his life, according to historical records, had defended his stake against multiple attempts at theft, and had spent 140 years replaying those conflicts with anyone who camped near his claim without understanding the territorial significance. I swung the pickaxe in a wide arc that Salazar dodged easily, his movement economical and practiced. He countered with a strike aimed at my legs, trying to cripple rather than kill, wanting to disable me before finishing the fight. I jumped backward and felt the pickaxe head whistle past my knees, close enough to tear my jeans. The other miners were shouting encouragement to Salazar in Spanish, betting on how long I'd last, treating this like entertainment they'd witnessed dozens of times before. Every claim jumper who'd camped near Total Wreck had probably faced this same trial, forced to fight ghosts who defended territory with violence that death hadn't diminished. I was just the latest in a long line of trespassers who'd failed to research the location before setting up camp. The fight lasted maybe 2 minutes. Salazar was faster, more skilled, and completely unburdened by fear of injury since he was already dead. I was terrified, exhausted from 3 days of minimal sleep, and wielding a weapon I'd never trained with against an opponent who'd perfected pickaxe combat through decades of practice. He got inside my guard and drove the wooden handle into my stomach, doubling me over, then swept my legs out from under me. I hit the ground hard and lost my grip on the pickaxe. Salazar stood over me with his weapon raised, the metal head positioned to fall and split my skull exactly as it had split the skulls of claim jumpers in the 1880s. The other miners had gone silent, watching the execution with the solemnity of men witnessing justice being served. I closed my eyes and waited for the impact. It didn't come. When I opened my eyes, Salazar was frozen mid-strike, his pickaxe held above his head, but not falling. The other miners were backing away, their expressions shifting from satisfaction to confusion. Something was wrong with the execution. Some protocol had been violated, and Salazar was reassessing whether I actually qualified as a claim jumper. He lowered his weapon and asked what I'd been mining specifically, what minerals I'd extracted from his claim. I explained Bitcoin again, described the process of solving cryptographic puzzles to validate blockchain transactions, articulated that I'd never touched his ore. He conferred with the other miners in rapid Spanish, and I caught fragments about technology and new mining methods and whether digital extraction constituted theft of physical claims. Salazar made his decision. He told me I wasn't a claim jumper because I hadn't jumped a claim. I'd been camping on stakes I didn't understand, using equipment that mined territory that didn't belong to anyone. But my ignorance didn't excuse the trespass, and my destruction of my equipment didn't satisfy the debt. I owed Total Wreck for 3 days of unauthorized presence on defended claims, and the debt would be paid in labor. He pointed toward the mine entrance, visible as a darker shadow against the dark hillside. I would work his claim for 3 nights, mining ore the traditional way, extracting real metal to replace the imaginary currency I'd been generating. If I survived 3 nights of ghost labor in a collapsed mine working alongside dead men, my debt would be satisfied, and I could leave. If I didn't survive, I'd join the 18 names on the list. Another claim jumper who'd learned that some territories never stop being defended. I worked 3 nights in the Total Wreck mine, descending into tunnels that had collapsed in the physical world but remained operational in whatever space the ghosts occupied. I swung pickaxes against ore faces that felt solid despite being rubble in present reality. I loaded ore carts that dead miners hauled to the surface through shafts that no longer existed above ground. I experienced frontier mining in all its brutal, exhausting, dangerous reality, working alongside men who died in cave-ins and accidents but continued their labor because their claims demanded it. On the 3rd night, Salazar declared my debt paid. My equipment was destroyed. My truck had been stripped for parts by living scavengers who'd found it abandoned, and I walked out of Total Wreck with nothing except the knowledge that some boundaries persist across centuries, and some territories never stop being defended regardless of who dies protecting them. Total Wreck sits in southeastern Arizona, its collapsed mines and scattered ruins looking peaceful in daylight. But at night, the claim holders emerge, maintaining their stakes with the same violence they used in life. They don't distinguish between traditional mining and modern extraction. Any mining on their claims is theft, and theft is punished according to frontier justice that never expired just because Arizona became a state. I was lucky they gave me the option to work off my debt. Most claim jumpers just get added to the list. Research your campsites before you set up. Some locations look abandoned but are still defended by people who died defending them and haven't stopped yet. If these Arizona ghost town stories left you terrified of ever visiting the desert again, hit that subscribe button for verified souls and join a community that explores the darkest corners of America's haunted history. Drop a comment telling us which story kept you up at night, and turn on notifications because we've got more encounters from abandoned places where the dead never left. Remember, some locations look empty but are still occupied by people who died there and don't realize they should be gone. Verified Souls brings you their stories, one nightmare at a time.